Chapter 505. Lionel held on to Aina for a long while. He lost track of time, but if he was truly paying attention, it was easily over an hour before Aina's tears slowed to a crawl. However, from start to finish, he didn't say a word. He only held her in his arms, a protective aura manifesting around him. At that moment, he didn't care who it was who stood before him, he wouldn't allow a single hair on her to be harmed. When Aina's tears stopped, she fell into a deep sleep. Without a care in the world, her cheek rested against Lionel's beating heart, its steady rhythm lulling her into a world of dreams. City Lord Kiefer sat at his desk, a blank look on his face as he gazed at the dim fire lamp before him. There were countless methods of keeping tabs on one's life and death in the dimensional verse. Since City Lord White was such an important piece of Terrain's invasion, it was no surprise that the cities would invest in monitoring her situation. Though City Lord Kiefer had expected to deal with casualties in this war, maybe the last person he had expected to lose was City Lord White. His heart couldn't help but swim with a torrent of emotions. His hand reached out, grasping the dying flame and allowing it to dance in his palm. Despite the fact it was a fire, it held no warmth. In fact, it was quite cold. Taking a deep breath, City Lord Kiefer squeezed his palm into a fist, shattering what remained of the flame. He closed his eyes, images of what happened during City Lord White's final moments playing in his mind. He had originally paid the ridiculous expense needed for this feature so that he could be aware of any powerful enemies their scouting reports might have missed out on. But, now, this had little to do with strategy and reconnaissance. He needed to see who had killed her. After a long while, City Lord Kiefer unclenched his fists, his eyes opening. His gaze held a slight hint of red within them that slowly dissipated. At that moment, Anred walked into his father's office. His gaze swept across the 12 fire lamps on his father's desk before he focused on the one that had been extinguished. His eyes narrowed. He knew his father well. Despite the fact that he and City Lord White hadn't had any relations since that fateful night so many rumors had been spread about, his father hadn't forgotten about her. Camelot should have been the easiest target. It was a place without foundations and with a people who had yet to awaken to their abilities. Even Anared had made his displeasure known for his father's decision back then. City Lord White was most definitely within the top 4 in terms of fighting prowess amongst the city lords. Even if she wasn't tasked with attacking the capital, she should have, at the very least, been assigned to either White Angel or Royal Blue Province, considering these were the 2nd and 3rd ranked provinces of Earth. Yet, because his father wanted to protect her, she was sent to Camelot. And somehow, she died in a place that should have been the safest? Anared didn't feel any particular affection for City Lord White. No, it was more accurate to say that he wouldn't lay his life on the line for her. But, he also wouldn't stand idly by if her life was in danger. For anyone who knew his personality, this would be quite shocking. Anared was overly protective of all those he saw as his own, but he wouldn't even raise a finger to aid those he had no relation to. The fact that he would help City Lord White at all spoke volumes. But how could he not? He knew well that Ree was his half-sister and that City Lord White was her mother. Ree thought that she was an orphan, but that was only because the little girl was just too simple. Why would a family like the Kiefer family treat a mere orphan so well? She lived the pampered life of a princess and in complete oblivion. Who killed her? Anared asked coldly. Anared's father remained silent for a long while, the beating of his heart becoming slower with each passing moment. Eventually, it regained its former calm. Aina Brazinger. Anared's pupils constricted when he heard these words. He thought that any expert that managed to kill her would have been an unknown. He had only asked as a formality, expecting a description rather than a name. Even if he did prepare himself to hear a name, this was the very last name he had expected to. He knew the name Aina Brazinger well since that girl had managed to do something he trained for over a decade to do without lifting a single finger. That said, Aina couldn't even defeat Jilnia. How could she possibly stand a chance against City Lord White? Was that some sort of joke? Could you have seen wrongly? No. City Lord Kiefer responded blandly. However, she seemed to have used some double-edged technique that left her incapacitated. We have no way of knowing how often she can use it or even if she would dare to use it again. Hearing this, Anared finally understood somewhat. So, it was a berserk-type ability. Berserk abilities weren't too rare. Those who had strength-based abilities like Aina's would often awaken them as they continued to evolve. It was a natural progression. Often, added strength was related to tapping into more of the Bodhi's potential, so berserk skills were the next natural step. Of course, Anared only thought this because he had no idea that Aina's ability wasn't a strength-based ability, but rather a healing-based one. Should I lead a troop to Camelot, then? Such a skill wouldn't be able to be activated twice in quick succession. This is a good opportunity. City Lord Kiefer stood, his visage expressionless. No. City Lord Hargrove is already in position and everything is prepared. We need to be swift and strike fast, giving them no opportunity to counter. Go support him. Anared nodded and left, a killing intent hidden deep within his eyes. Ree might not know that City Lord White was her mother, but there was only so long the little girl could remain so naive. Since they actually dared to harm his little sister like this, Anared would make them repay this debt in blood. He wondered what Earth would do when tens of thousands of criminals from its own dark cloud prison were suddenly released. Chapter 506. Aina shifted in Lionel's arms. When she realized where she was, she began to blush profusely. But, as much as she wanted to run away, she didn't dare to at this point. She really regretted throwing all her clothes away now. And why was this damn water so clear? Lionel's chuckling awoke Aina from her own thoughts. By now, her entire body had turned into a deep shade of red. Unfortunately, the only place she had to hide was Lionel's chest. Oof. Don't squirm so much. Though Lionel was laughing at Aina, he too wanted to shed tears. Didn't this girl realize where she was sitting? He had displayed enough willpower for a lifetime today. Aina blinked, peeking up from Lionel's chest. A bright smile spread across her lips, her embarrassment suddenly vanishing. It's not like this is the first time I've seen it. Lionel almost choked on air again. That wasn't me. Lionel defended himself. It wasn't his fault. It really wasn't. Back then, the primitive man had had control over his body. Damn, by now, he had already forgotten about that embarrassing moment, only for Aina to bring it up again. He felt as though he had suffered a lethal combo. Aina giggled. Only she knew that that wasn't what she was referring to. But, if Lionel knew that she was referring to a certain event that happened in the Joan Zone, it was unknown how he would react. Lionel was unconscious back then, so he had no way of knowing what happened. And, even if he had been conscious, at this very moment, he was suddenly very much aware of two soft mounds pressed against his chest. So, he couldn't quite focus on anything else. I'm sorry. Aina's sudden words caught Lionel off guard. The lewd thoughts he had had vanished like the wind soon afterward. Lionel brought a hand to Aina's cheek, forcing her to look at him. You have nothing to apologize for. He said seriously. In fact, I'm sorry. I was so focused on other things that I didn't even realize so much time had passed. Lionel didn't think that Aina would think he had abandoned her. Back then, he purposely left the segmented cube with Aina as a sign of exactly that. He had only taken the segmented cube with him before he left to the Demon Empire. But, things hadn't worked out as he had expected. Lionel was a person who could break things down into their simple details and analyze them logically. If he was in Aina's place, he would have seen through the fact he left behind the segmented cube as a good sign. But, that didn't mean that Aina herself would see it as such. In fact, when he thought about it, Aina could have easily seen the segmented cube as a sign of pity. After all, it had the only cure to her scars within it. So, who knew how she really saw such an action? Aina furiously shook her head at Lionel's words. I'm the one who pushed you away. I couldn't even answer a simple question. When Aina thought back to it, even she couldn't quite explain why she had dodged Lionel's questions like that. He had only been worried about her. Though back then she had only tried to downplay things to reassure him, the more she thought about it, the more guilty she felt. She had wanted to say she was fine and that she had made it out alive, so it wasn't a big deal. But her words had come off like Lionel shouldn't care so much. When a stranger or an acquaintance asked you how your day went, most would give a perfunctory answer even if your day really had been terrible. Only when in the presence of those you truly trusted would you give a real answer. Anna's words back then had practically treated Lionel as though he was an acquaintance she was sharing a few words with rather than a man she could give her heart to. It was no wonder Lionel had chosen to pull away at that moment. Lionel shook his head and smiled, gently stroking Anna's cheek. Forget it. It's not a big deal. No. Anna shook her head again. It is a big deal. Anna took a deep breath and began to speak. She didn't allow Lionel to cut her off or say that it was fine again. She knew that Lionel cared too much about her. If she really allowed him to say that it was fine, he would simply never ask about such sensitive topics again. From observing Lionel for so long, she had realized that he was simply too good at separating his emotions from his logic. And he almost always let logic dictate his actions first and foremost. She didn't want such an artificial barrier to exist between them because even if she hadn't said it in but so many words, she too cared about Lionel. In fact, she had cared about him for a long time already. So, she spoke. She began with what happened when she was randomly teleported to a wasteland of terrain, to how she ran into the variant zone, to her run-in with the heirs and heiress of the three powers. She told Lionel about how she had escaped them, and then she began to describe how she ran into the mountain sands range and about how she entered the maze of tunnels. When she got to the appearance of the puppet master, her body began to involuntarily tremble once again. But, this time, within Lionel's arms, she gained the strength to speak. She looked into Lionel's eyes from start to finish, finding a steady calm within their fathomless depths. She watched as a spark of rage lit within them and observed as it boiled over like a frightening eruption of magma. Anyone else, beneath such pressure, would feel as though their souls were being crushed and that their hearts could no longer beat. But Anna hadn't felt so comfortable in her life. Watching Lionel become infuriated for her sake made her heart beat wildly and filled her stomach with butterflies. By now, Lionel's rage had superseded his lust, so his member was no longer at attention. But it was now Anna's turn to feel a fire light her lower belly. She felt that Lionel was exceptionally attractive when he was leading men like he had his teammates just a couple months ago. But now, she found it hard to decide which version of him she liked more. The leader version? Or this protective version? Her thighs couldn't help but squeeze down slightly on either side of Lionel's hips. She had a feeling that if she tried to break past that certain barrier now, it would be much easier and not nearly as painful. Chapter 507. Lionel had no idea that Anna had been lit afire. If it wasn't because he wanted to listen to the story to the end and didn't want to leave Anna at this moment, he might have charged off to earn another talisman to terrain. To dare have designs on his Anna. If he ever ran into this so-called puppet master, Lionel would be certain to rip him to shreds. Anna paused, her amber eyes scanning Lionel's face as though she wanted to memorize every line and slope. She always knew that Lionel was quite handsome. His tan skin, his pale green eyes, his strong jaw. She had to admit that she missed his messy dirty blonde hair. But this long bronze hair made him look particularly masculine, almost like a Roman god, especially when it was paired with his broad shoulders and chest. It was only at this moment that she realized that she had never observed Lionel so closely before. She had always been too shy to do so in the past. But now she felt many times more comfortable doing so, especially since Lionel's mind was hardly focused on her actions at the moment. He hung on her every word instead, as though trying to visualize the day he would kill this puppet master. How did you escape? Lionel's sudden question shook Anna out of her fantasy land. She blushed slightly, but noticing that Lionel hadn't found anything odd about her actions, she continued. I never expected for my curse to help me in such a way. Anna started again. I usually use its suppressive effects to help with my training, but I didn't expect for my blood to carry the same effect. After it consumed my blood, it became severely weakened and the restrictions on me lessened. I wanted to kill it right then and there, but it began to summon more of its guards. Back then I entered a weird state. I'm not sure how to describe it, but I've never felt so powerful before. The restrictions on my mind seemed to loosen and I could feel his other puppets coming, but these puppets were completely unlike the uncoordinated ones he used to mine in the mountains. In fact, some of them had consciousnesses of their own and were exceptionally powerful. Most had strength at tier 7 and above. Also, though he was weakened, he was still half a step into the 5th dimension. It was fine if he spent all his strength suppressing the curse. In that case, he wouldn't be able to move. But, if I forced him to attack, I was sure that he could still kill me, so, taking advantage of my strengthened state, I stole the capsule he wanted to imprison me in and ran away. It's hard for me to remember much about what happened after that, it's all so hazy. Aina frowned, her delicate brow wrinkling. Though she seemed to have knife wounds across her face, Lionel found her current appearance quite adorable. Or, rather, he would have had he not been so pissed. Wait, your strengthened state? Is that part of your ability? Lionel asked curiously. Aina hesitated. Though she said she didn't know how she got to that strengthened state. She hadn't told the whole truth. She had a vague idea. It was just that. Her face was already scarred. If Lionel knew that she drank blood, would he really not want her anymore? How could he want to be with such a gross woman? How was she any different from the variant invalid who had eaten all those people? In fact, if it wasn't for him, she wouldn't have been able to enter such a strengthened state because the blood she got was precisely from those desecrated corpses. Aina opened her mouth but hesitated again. No. I can't not answer again, Aina grit her teeth. Lionel blinked curiously, waiting with patience. The blood from the human carcasses the puppet master had spread across the table. I ingested it. Aina's words seemed to take all the strength out of her. She felt like she was going to collapse that very moment. Her voice was as soft as could be, almost beneath what a human could possibly pick up with their ears. What? Lionel responded. Hearing this, Aina paled considerably, her eyes breaking away from Lionel's as she looked down. Her breathing hitched, she was almost on the verge of another panic attack. What would she do now? But, Lionel's next words left her stunned. That's so cool. Huh? Aina looked up somewhat weakly, at a loss for words. Just imagine it, if I told the guys that my girlfriend was a vampire, they would die from envy, don't you think? Lionel grinned wildly, his face carrying with it a naive, boyish charm. It was hard to believe that this was the same man who struck so much fear on the battlefield. At that moment, he was far more like the boy who said Shield Cross Stars had a cool uniform rather than the man who reaped lives with a single thought. As for thinking Aina was gross, Lionel had never had such thoughts. He so easily accepted the little mink's darkness affinity, why would he care about drinking blood? Though current technology was far beyond it, he had even read about how their ancestors used to use blood transfusions to save the sick and injured. How was that much different from ingesting blood? Lionel, at least, didn't see much of a difference. All he had thoughts of was having a cool vampire girlfriend. That would definitely give him points to show off to the boys. He couldn't help but grin like a little boy. And, because he was so busy grinning, he couldn't react before Aina shifted upward, her lips planting firmly against his. Aina's palms held Lionel's face in place as though she was scared he would run away. At that moment, she only wanted to kiss him so deeply that the memory was engraved onto her mind. Lionel was stunned for a moment, but a heat in his chest tossed such thoughts out of his mind. He wrapped his arms around Aina's waist as her hands traveled to the back of his head. The two embraced one another, their lips locked. Aina shivered when she felt Lionel's tongue invade her mouth, but she didn't resist. It felt like a warm liquid was filling her body, her mind entering a state of euphoria it had never tasted before. Chapter 508. Aina sunk her fingers into the heavy threads of Lionel's hair. She had never experienced such an intoxicating feeling before. When Lionel shamelessly stole her first kiss, her heart had fluttered and her mind had grown foggy. But that moment had been filled with innocence and purity. It was the kind of memory that filled one with sweetness. But at this moment, Aina didn't feel sweetness. She felt heat, as though her entire body was burning up from the inside out. However, rather than wanting to separate from Lionel, she only wanted to get closer. Lionel could feel the same heat. And maybe, in some way, it was even more potent for him. Aina might have been petite, but her chest had volume that left him at a loss for words. Her face might have been scarred, but he couldn't find a single other flaw on her body. Everything from her touch, to her breath, to the silky smoothness of her skin left him in a daze. Lionel's hands slipped down from her waist, grasping the underside of Aina's thighs and lifting her up. Aina gasped slightly from the sudden change, subconsciously causing her arms and legs to wrap around Lionel tighter. With the strength she used, maybe if it wasn't for the fact Lionel had a metal body, his bones would have been crushed. Being risen into the sky, Aina felt one part helpless and another part elated. She loved the feeling of Lionel sweeping her off her feet, the feeling of him bearing her weight in his strong arms. Lionel gently placed Aina down at the side of the pool. From this position, all he could imagine was thrusting into her with all his might. The instinct was so potent that his body trembled, his cock pulsing as though a beast struggling against its chain. Aina could feel Lionel pressing against her below. Her mind was somewhat hazy, feeling just as intoxicated as Lionel's own. She could feel a wetness spreading that had little to do with the pool of water they had just been in. She had a mind to let Lionel do as he pleased. No, she wanted him to do as he pleased. It was a completely different feeling from before. Whereas previously she felt like she had to, now, she wanted to. But somewhere deep inside, she didn't quite feel ready yet. It wasn't because she didn't trust Lionel, nor was it because she didn't have feelings for him. She just felt that things were moving too fast, it left her at a loss. She separated from Lionel's kiss, pressing her forehead against his. Her hands held onto his cheeks as he held onto her hips. Her thighs trembled against Lionel's sides when she felt his heated shaft pressing against her below. Aina reached a hand down from Lionel's face and began to slowly stroke him, her movements gentle and caring. Lionel's breathing hitched, his gaze carrying a tinge of red as it locked onto Aina's. He could see the affection within those amber irises. Though her movements were slightly awkward and unrefined, just the fact she was willing to try left his heart feeling warm. "Look at me," Aina said softly, her words tickling Lionel's eardrums. As a 5-star health professional, Aina was more familiar with the human body and its psychology than most. The same way she knew that it would be dangerous if Lionel's lower region wasn't cleaned was the same way she knew that men were visual creatures. Even if she couldn't give everything to Lionel at this moment, she still wanted him to know that she was his. Lionel's breathing quickened, his eyes hesitating somewhat before leaving Aina's gaze and traveling downward. The feeling of her hands slowly moving up and down seemed to intensify, his body heating up like flamed coals. All this time, he had been subconsciously avoiding looking at Aina's body. It was one part due to respect and another part due to him not wanting her to think he hated the sight of her face. But, hearing her ask him to do it so blatantly left his mouth dry. At that moment, Lionel stood at the edge of the pool, Aina seated at its ledge, her legs wrapped around his hips. Their foreheads were lightly pressed against one another, giving Lionel a vantage point that almost made his nose bleed. Aina leaned back slightly, her hand motions never slowing. She invited him to gaze at her body, a gentle red blush dancing across her skin. The first thing Lionel saw was Aina's toned belly, glistening with wetness. With her half-seated position, it flexed beneath the lights of the bathhouse and the shadow of his head. With Aina's every breath, her abs constricted, showing off the faint outline of a powerful physique. Lionel felt as though he could watch her breathe like this indefinitely. "Move my hair," Aina whispered. Lionel gulped. Aina's hair draped over her shoulders, blocking much of the view of her chest. All Lionel could see were two rounded protrusions. With slow movements, Lionel brought a hand up, sliding it underneath Anna's hair from her shoulder and moving it away. Anna's blush became more furious, the redness of her skin only making her more alluring. Lionel could see the rapid beating of her heart through her skin. Every pulse made her chest move just a bit, leaving him at a loss for words. He had never seen something so beautiful in his life. He had been feeling it against his chest all this time, but this was the first time he truly knew how gorgeous the sight could be. Even with how large his hands were, he didn't believe he could cover them completely. The healthy drop, the alluring pink dots, the perkiness of youth. It left him not knowing how to breathe. It was perfect. Touch me. As though too embarrassed to look Lionel in the eye when she said this, Anna dove into another kiss, her hand movements increasing just the slightest bit. Her movement caused Lionel's hand, which had been hovering after moving her hair, to land directly onto her chest. The supple silkiness of her skin sent Lionel into cloud nine. He couldn't hold back anymore. Anna felt the pulsing of the raging beast in her hand grow past a point of no return. But, this time, she didn't try to avoid what came out. She focused entirely on their kiss, a deep happiness blooming in her heart. Chapter 509. Lionel's sharp intake of breath slowly calmed, his emotions sitting on a cloud high above. He didn't believe that there could be a greater happiness in the world. It wasn't just about the feeling itself, but rather about the fact the woman he liked so much had been by his side during it. You didn't have to do that. Lionel's voice carried an edgy gruff to it. Maybe it would still take him a while longer to recover completely. No, I didn't have to. Anna said with a sweet smile. I wanted to. Lionel smiled beside himself. Looks like we need another bath. Lionel said playfully before hoisting Anna up again. She giggled lightly, letting Lionel do as he pleased. While the couple were in their own little world, they had no idea about the goings-on outside. Though the segmented cube had been left right in the middle of a battlefield, no one dared to disturb it. Was that a joke? With how wrathful Lionel had been despite the fact no one had actually laid a finger on Anna, how would he react if they tried to interfere in his matters now? By now, though, the battlefield had been cleared and the dead had been dumped in a pile to be burned. Or, rather, Arthur had tried to do this, only to realize there was no chance of burning the corpses of fourth-dimensional entities with normal flames. Without a choice, he had to call upon one of Camelot's 3-star magi to do the job. The last thing they could afford now was some sort of diseased outbreak. Arthur didn't know if the fourth dimension still had plagues, but what he did know was that if they did, they would be far beyond what a disease of the third dimension could compare to. There was no need to take such a risk. It was during these moments that the others finally learned of what happened at the Demon Empire. He did what? King Arthur stood in a daze, looking toward Krakos as though he was examining a mentally ill patient. He wasn't very fond of demons to begin with, so he was hesitant to believe their words in any situation, let alone this one. Krakos looked down toward Arthur, his gaze indifferent and his demeanor carrying the very same scholarly air. He didn't understand the rhetorical question culture of humans. In fact, he didn't understand their sarcasm either. He knew well that Arthur had already heard what he said, so there was absolutely no need for him to repeat himself. Stop. Mordred put out a hand, stopping the situation from reaching a point of escalation. Is what you said true, Krakos? Krakos nodded seriously. Yes, Your Majesty. He helped us to eradicate the entire army. The ones we tried to capture killed themselves, so now there's no one left. There should only be the normal citizens of White City left. Before he left, Lionel suggested that we mobilize an army to capture it. Capture White City? Mordred fell into her thoughts. It was indeed not a good idea to leave a city filled with citizens of another world unconquered. Also, there was always the chance of others coming to take it over. If that happened, then Camelot would be thrust right back into the same situation. Mordred looked toward her father and they both nodded. They were both aware that Lionel's suggestion was the smartest. It was really inadvisable to leave a city unchecked in their territory like this. "All right, we will." Arthur's words paused, his gaze narrowing. At the moment, the three of them, Arthur, Mordred and Krakos, were within a military tent on the very same battlefield city Lord White had fallen on. It had been about 2 days since Noah and his troop left. Of course, Arthur didn't blame them for leaving. After the ass-whooping Lionel gave them, he wouldn't have had the face to stay either. But, to think they would come back. From the looks of it, it seemed that Noah had semi-recovered while Niall was nowhere to be seen. In truth, Lionel was quite lenient with Niall at the time. He could have blasted a hole through his heart, but he gave the junior Governor Duke a chance at life. Whether he seized it or not seemed to remain to be seen. Noah led the troop, his face pale. It was clear that he was still heavily injured. Yet, if it wasn't for the natural reaction of his skin tone, it would be impossible to tell from his facial expressions. Noah swept a glance over the battlefield. Seeing that the segmented cube was still in the same place it had been before, his gaze flashed with an imperceptible light, but he didn't say anything until he made his way to Arthur's tent riding upon the back of another black wolf. With a leap, Noah descended from the back of the wolf as Arthur, Mordred and Krakos exited the tent. Without mincing his words, Noah spoke. "White City has been captured and I've stationed half of my army to keep the order. I will need to return to Earth to report this to my imperial grandfather. Before I do, we have yet to begin our negotiations." Mordred and Arthur's expressions became serious. Even if most of White City's main forces had already died, capturing a city was no laughing matter, especially not in such a heavily injured state. Yet, Noah had done it. It was impossible for Terrain to not have made contingency plans to protect their cities. So, how had he done it exactly? But, even beyond this, in all the chaos, they had almost forgotten that there were negotiations that had yet to be completed. Let alone completed, they hadn't even begun. Before, they had been reliant on Lionel, but now that they knew that Lionel was actually a prince of this royal family, could they still count on him the same? At that moment, the segmented cube which had remained immobile for the past several days suddenly moved. 2 figures walking hand in hand appeared out of it. One was a smiling young man and the other was a young girl wearing a mask. Despite the fact they were only leisurely walking and idly chatting with one another, the world's energies seemed to revolve around them. Chapter 5:10. Lionel pocketed the segmented cube and seemed to finally realize that the atmosphere was a bit off. He swept a gaze forward and noticed Noah. After a brief pause, he turned back to Aina. "Are you sure that it's comfortable?" Aina giggled. This was the 4th or 5th time Lionel had asked this question. "Yes, really, it is." She lightly touched the mask on her face, a light smile blooming beneath. She normally wouldn't wear a mask, but the purpose of this one wasn't to hide her appearance. After learning about Aina's curse and the time limit, Lionel found out that there was a way to delay the progress of the curse. It was obvious that it was greatly suppressed by cleansing waters, so Lionel chose to craft a mask for Aina that could help her. What he hadn't expected, though, was for Aina to like the mask so much. Though she never said anything, the curse placed her in a perpetual state of discomfort. Even in its least inflamed form where her scars appeared no different from knife wounds, there was an uncomfortable tightness and itchiness she always had to deal with. But, for the first time, she felt completely at ease. If she didn't know better, she would have thought that Lionel had cured her completely. The mask itself was something that Lionel put his heart and soul into. It was actually the reason they had taken an extra 2 days to exit the segmented cube, other than celebrating Aina's birthday, of course. The mask used the pearl of the purifying fog clam as a base. It gave the mask itself a premium white glow that seemed somewhat like marble but carried the off-whiteness and milky texture of pearls. The inner workings of the mask were forged with the ice vein type or Misty Dream Oregon. The purifying fog clam was known for its ability to turn large amounts of water into a gentle mist that almost appeared like fog. As for the Mist Dream ice vein ore, it was known for its ability to keep its ice-like state even in the hottest of climates, almost as though it was in its own dream world regardless of the environment. Lionel crafted veins patterns throughout the mask with the misty dream ore and filled its innards with cleansing waters. The combination of the two allowed Aina to have a fine mist of cleansing water perpetually hovering around her face. Any unease she had completely vanished. In the end, the mask gained the appearance of a beautiful piece of art. The contrast of the milky whiteness to the sharp blue lines of the misty dream ore made it look particularly dazzling. In fact, even Aina hadn't expected to like it so much. What she was more shocked about, though, was the fact that Lionel actually managed to give it defensive strength rivaling a Tier 8 black treasure despite the fact it wasn't designed with such a thing in mind. Others might not know how valuable force crafters were, but how could Aina not be aware? The realization that Lionel hadn't been joking before left her quite stunned. Of course, she hadn't thought that Lionel had been lying. He wasn't that type of person. Rather, she was more shocked by Lionel's level of skill. From what she understood, he was almost at the standard of a fifth-dimensional force crafter. At his age, at least in worlds as weak as theirs. That was completely unheard of. Mordred smiled bitterly when she saw how the two were still somehow in their own world. Didn't they see the gravity of the situation? Mordred cleared her throat. Ah, right. Lionel looked up toward Mordred and grinned. Sorry, I heard that there were negotiations happening now. I've already promised Em to take the helm in these matters, so if you want to negotiate, you'll be doing so with me. Hearing these words, Mordred couldn't help but smile. It seemed that she had thought too much before. That was right, if he was willing to beat this cousin of his so savagely, there shouldn't have been anything to worry about to begin with. Jessica, who had descended to Noah's side, frowned when she heard these words. As the Prince of the Empire, something like Lionel negotiating on behalf of outsiders was highly inappropriate. She wanted to open her mouth to say something, but Noah stretched out a hand that stopped her. As you wish. Lionel nodded. Soon, the group had entered the military tent. Lionel sat on one side of the table with Aina to his left and Mordred to his right. As for King Arthur, he sat to the right of his daughter. On the other side of the table, Noah faced Lionel with Jessica to his side. On the other side of Noah, there was another young man. The young man had his long hair done up in an elaborate bun that seemed to come straight out of an ancient world. He had sharp features and an even sharper gaze, all hidden behind his glasses. However, while the glasses Lionel's father wore were more of gimmick because he simply liked their appearance, Lionel could tell that the glasses of this young man were actually a treasure that helped boost his ocular ability. The young man swept a gaze toward Lionel before observing Mordred and then finally turning toward Aina. But, before he could, Lionel snorted lightly. An audible crack resounded in the quiet room. The glasses of the young man snapped, their lenses breaking into tiny fragments. If it wasn't because the young man was quick to close his eyes as soon as he realized that something was wrong, he may very well have been blinded in that moment. Lionel's gaze didn't shift away from the young man as the latter slowly took his glasses off, his visage indifferent but the aura he was exuding reaching a tangible level. Watch where you're looking, please, or else I'll have to ask you to leave. Chapter 5:11. Lionel's voice came out with an undeniable edge to it. Those glasses, with his skill as a force crafter, he could easily see through their abilities. Even if this young man wasn't necessarily using it in a perverted manner, Lionel had no intention on relying on his good nature. The young man slowly placed his glasses down on the table before them, wiping away the small shards of glass that hadn't managed to pierce his skin. Judging by his expression, one would have never guessed that he had just been humiliated. His treasure could indeed see through more than what the human eye was capable of. As for whether he was truly planning on using his glasses like this, maybe only he was aware of the answer to that. The young man looked up from his broken glasses to Lionel, his gaze remaining even. Lionel matched his gaze, not a hint of remorse in his eyes. My name is Noah Fox, I'm here on behalf of the Empire as the representative of the Fox royal family. This is Jessica Scarlet, she is the representative of the Scarlet Grand Prime Minister family. This is Tyrion Dove, he is the representative of the Dove Grand Prime Minister family. Noah didn't address the small scuffle between Lionel and Tyrion in the slightest. He made his way forward with introductions without a care. Lionel turned his gaze from Tyrion, focusing it on his cousin. He had to admit that Noah had perfected the air of a prince. In this regard, he was far beyond Lioness despite being a few years younger. The proposal is simple. Noah spoke with a royal air, his presence seeming several times larger than his actual stature would dictate. Camelot and the Demon Empire will be annexed to become the second moon of Earth. Your status will be that of probationary citizens. Jessica. Jessica nodded, hearing her name called. Probationary citizenship allows you 2/3 the rights of official citizens of Earth. You will be protected by the same laws, however your voting rights are reduced by 1/3 and your punishments are increased by the same measure. This status will last until the end of the war, wherein you will be instated as official citizens of the Empire. Depending on your performance, you may be conferred a Chief Earl title under the Pendragon name. Jessica brought out several drafted documents. They piled up onto the table, totaling at least a few dozen pages. King Arthur frowned at these words. He didn't like these terms very much at all. He was essentially tasked with defending what amounted to half a large continent of Earth in return for an Earl title. He might not know what the titles of Earth were and how they compared to Camelot's, but Earl was an easily identifiable title for him. That was enough to tell him that he would have next to no speaking power. However, instead of lashing out like he wanted to, he remained silent, leaving these matters in Lionel's hands. Since he had already resigned himself to this life, it hardly made a difference. Whether he was an earl or a duke, who cared if he was no longer king? Lionel didn't respond to Noah or Jessica. Instead, he reached for the papers. Under the confused gazes of everyone present, he flipped through them one by one, not remaining on a single page for more than a second. Jessica's brow wrinkled slightly. Was he planning on reading it? But if he really was planning on reading it, why was he flipping through the pages so quickly? What Jessica didn't know was that Lionel had already slowed himself down considerably. Let alone a second a page, all he would have to do is spread these pages out and he could read all more than 50 sheets in that same time frame. After a while, Lionel placed the documents down and closed his eyes. Lionel quickly organized all the information, jumped through the legal talk and reached the core of the documents. Ultimately, this document was mostly created to familiarize Camelot with the laws of Earth. Only a small portion of it actually detailed the agreement between the two nations. But this was good for Lionel as well. Though he knew the main tenets of Earth's laws, when it came to the details, he was severely lacking. The document was unlikely to list all of Earth's laws. After all, it was only a few dozen sheets while Earth had long since moved past the usage of paper. Clearly, they had only gone back due to the completion of the metamorphosis, making technology all but useless. But this was enough. Lionel opened his eyes. The simple action made Jessica shudder. But the feeling of oppression soon vanished as they regained their focus. Accept them as official citizens of the Empire, remove the guaranteed Chief Earl title, and document Camelot as a probationary province. Noah's expression finally shifted from something other than indifference. His head tilted slightly, a hint of questioning in his gaze. If we do things like this, the Pendragon family will not be guaranteed any title. It is very possible that they will become commoners. Under these conditions, the people of Camelot are no longer of Camelot. As such, their merits are their own and won't count for the Pendragon family. Though the Empire's initial offer sounded bad, after reading the document, Lionel felt they were surprisingly fair. Probationary citizen sounded like a bad title, but it essentially allowed Camelot autonomy to continue functioning as its own nation until the war ended. As such, the merits of Camelot's armies would count toward Camelot and allow it to earn up to an earl title in the end. But Lionel was essentially asking to remove this failsafe. By allowing Camelot to become official citizens of Earth right this moment, they were all starting as commoners. How could commoners lead people? Obviously, they didn't have the right to do so. So, Any merits Camelot accomplished would be equally spread to its millions of citizens rather than concentrating into Arthur's or Mordred's hands. Though this method would allow the Pendragons a chance to achieve a royal title higher than Earl, it also meant that they could effectively end up with nothing unless they had astounding single-person feats. Though the code black of the Empire seemed to throw the nobles to the wolves, the truth was that they still had many advantages commoners didn't have. As nobles, they had subordinates that were recognized by law. Those subordinates could funnel their merits toward these nobles, making it easier for them to retain their titles. However, if Arthur and Mordred became official citizens now, they wouldn't have this luxury any longer. "I'm certain," Lionel replied. "After all, as a prince, I can allocate my merits however I please." Noah's pupils constricted into pinholes. That was right. There was one family that didn't have to worry about democracy on Earth, and that was the Fox family. But how could Lionel alone amass more merits than those royal families with tens to hundreds of thousands of subordinates? Just as Noah wanted to open his mouth to say something, a talisman on Jessica's person suddenly glowed. At first, she listened to the message passed to her in silence, but after a while, her cold expression furrowed into a frown. Chapter 5:12. Jessica's expression only seemed to become worse with each passing moment. When the message finally came to a close, she began to whisper into Noah's ear. Clearly, the matter was too urgent for her to even consider leaving this place first. But it was precisely because of this that Lionel learned exactly what happened. With his senses, how could he not make out a whisper? In fact, even Aina was capable of doing the same thing. Though her mind wasn't on the same level as Lionel's, her 5 senses were greatly heightened. Dream Cloud Prison. Lionel's gaze narrowed. Dream Cloud Prison, compared to prisons from ancient times, could be considered a paradise. The Empire put a lot of effort into rehabilitation, more than what could be said for most nations of the past. However, even with this being the case, there were many who would never step foot outside of the prison. And many of those who never would, had never even committed crimes before. This sounded like a shocking matter, but considering the history of the Empire, maybe it wasn't so after a moment of thought. The gene analysis exam wasn't just a prerequisite for finding future talents. It was also a test for finding future criminals. Those that had a high potential to commit petty crimes in the future were mostly ignored. These individuals were allowed to live out their lives and would only be escorted to Dark Cloud Prison upon committing the crimes in question. However, there were those who were born with more sinister tastes, those who had a high potential for violence and murder. Those people were classified as grade prisoners and were introduced into Dark Cloud Prison in their infancy. They received visitation from their family. But, other than this, they would spend their lives within the walls of the Dark Cloud Prison. But, this was only the beginning. While there were those with potential for horrid acts of violence and murder, there were others who not only had such desires, but also had tools to commit them that far surpassed the normal person. These people were geniuses who were born to be 5-star professionals, prodigies that had impossible levels of intelligence to match their twisted nature. They were known as dark prisoners and received the highest level of security Dark Cloud Prison had to offer. As for whether it was ethical to punish people before they committed the crimes they were supposedly destined to, Lionel wasn't sure. If he was honest with himself, he never really thought about it before. Dark Cloud Prison was so far and away out of his mind in his day-to-day life that, like most privileged people, he just never thought about it. But now, it seemed that Dark Cloud Prison had no intention of staying away from his life any longer. That said, judging by Jessica's words, this seemed like a good opportunity. When Jessica finished whispering to Noah, his expression, too, became serious. Lionel smiled and looked toward Aina. "Want to go to Dark Cloud Province?" Jessica's lip twitched when she heard these words. He didn't even bother asking them first how they felt about it. And, couldn't he have at least pretended as though he hadn't heard anything? After all, this was technically top-secret information. But, when Jessica remembered that Lionel was also technically a prince, she realized that he really could do whatever he wanted. Unless her father or Tyrion's father was here, there would be no way to command him to do anything. And, even in that case, Jessica somehow believed it wouldn't matter. After all, it really didn't seem like Lionel was relying on the prince title at all. He would have done whatever he wanted to do from the very beginning. Aina nodded at Lionel's suggestion. At this point, both of their goals were in sync. Aina wanted to grow stronger and so did Lionel. If he didn't grow stronger, how could he possibly upgrade the segmented cube to cure Aina? It's settled then. Lionel smiled and looked back toward Noah, Jessica and Tyrion. I think my proposal was in line with the Empire's bottom line, correct? Noah gazed at Lionel for a moment before nodding. Good. Not long later, Noah, Jessica and Tyrion got up to leave. Tyrion left behind a slight smile, but didn't say anything from the start of the meeting to the end. It was difficult to tell if this was just his personality or if there was something else. So what hole did you throw me into, kid? Finally, Arthur couldn't hold back any longer. He had heard the negotiations, but without understanding Earth's laws, it was tough for him to follow everything that was said. In the end, he could only trust in Lionel, something that left him feeling somewhat uncomfortable. Lionel chuckled. It's a good thing, I promise. After Lionel finished his explanation, Mordred and Arthur fell into their own thoughts. So we have to rely on you? Arthur sighed. Well, not necessarily. Lionel said with a grin. What do you mean by that? Well, what do you think I was doing before I came to this battlefield? Wait, but according to your reasoning, anything we did before becoming official citizens is void. And, even if our fight against White City was counted, it would be split even across every soldier that participated in the war. That wouldn't be enough merits to even trade for a Tier 4 official title, let alone a noble title. Arthur pressed his brows together. Yes, you weren't official citizens. But, what about me? Lionel's grin widened. Ah. Arthur and Mordred suddenly came to a realization. That was right. While their merits would be mitigated, Lionel wasn't in the same boat. Hadn't he just wiped out 10 White Knights and over half of White City's elite forces practically on his own? Not only did a prince take out half of the army, but this prince's girlfriend also killed their city lord. Aina blushed slightly beneath her mask and looked away. But, she didn't make any attempts to refute. Seeing such a scene, Mordred grinned and winked at Lionel only for him to put 2 big thumbs up. Aina can be considered a person under my wing, so you can say, effectively, all the merits for clearing out White City falls to us. Giving those merits over to the Pendragon family is well within my rights. Though I'm not sure how many merits the other nobles have, I read over the method of calculation. If my simulations are correct, there should already be no problem to trade for a Secretary Marquis title. Lionel smiled lightly, his cheeriness being seen in a new light by the father-daughter pair. Chapter 5:13. Do you want us to come with you? Mordred asked. Lionel shook his head. He was less interested about the state of Earth and more interested about his own personal strength growing. After witnessing Noah's comprehension of winter, he felt like he had finally come to understand something, so he wanted to test those waters. And, even if he hadn't, it was better for Mordred and Arthur to stay here. I don't believe that they'll give up on Camelot so easily. Depending on how the wars on other provinces go, they might send another group here. It's best if you remain in this place. Arthur and Mordred nodded. But, defending isn't all you should do. Lionel suddenly thought of something. Put some effort into organizing your people. With all of them slowly awakening to their abilities, there's definitely a lot of untapped potential. It's hard to tell how long this war will go on for, but Camelot could play a bigger role than it seems. I didn't say this before, but even if I can give you merits as a prince, there's still a limit to how much. For example, I can't just give you enough for a Grand Prime Minister title. If you wanted such a position, you'll have to fight for it yourself. Arthur's gaze narrowed, but in the end, he nodded. After saying this, Lionel grabbed onto Aina's small hand and walked out of the military tent. He quite enjoyed the feeling, so he most definitely wouldn't let an opportunity to do so slip by. But, while he was in his own world, he almost didn't notice that Noah and Jessica were actually still waiting for him outside, stationed before their troop. Noah looked between Lionel and Aina. Truthfully, he didn't know how a prince of the empire ended up with a woman of the hidden families. Even when he brought this up to his grandfather, Emperor Fox brushed it off without a care in the world, as though it wasn't a big deal. In fact, his imperial grandfather even said that he should try to be more proactive in love too. Though his grandfather always seemed to have a warm air about him, Noah could feel the underlying oppression in his every action. Making such a joke in the past would have been impossible for the emperor. Yet, he had this time. Imperial grandfather has said that we can lead this expedition together. Noah said calmly. You can receive the same Tier 7 general title I hold, and you can choose half of my men to be under your command. Normally, when such a thing happened, the person suffering the most would be infuriated. Noah was effectively losing half his fighting strength, and warriors he had carefully nurtured for the past more than a year would be poached right beneath his eyes. But Noah didn't seem to care in the slightest. There weren't any fluctuations in his emotions, and he relayed his grandfather's orders without the smallest sign of reluctance. The various youths to Noah's back remained silent at these words. It was hard to tell if there was no uproar because it didn't matter to them one way, or if they were simply just this well trained. The number Noah led now was about half of what it once was, leaving it numbering at about 500. The remainder had been stationed at White City, and it seemed the Tyrann had gone to manage the situation over there. Lionel raised an eyebrow and looked toward the youths. They had all been there when he lost his temper, flying into a rage. So, there was no need to question his strength. But, commanding a group of men and women went beyond just strength. It required judgment and intellect. Lionel wondered. Should he take his grandfather up on his offer? Or should he go with Aina alone? After a while, Lionel made a decision. No, rather. It felt more like an instinct, as though he couldn't pick another way even if he tried. All right. Lionel said with a nod. Then, he drew a line down the middle of Noah's troop and took half. Dark Cloud Province was an oddly peaceful place. Along with the capital, it was among the only 2 provinces of Earth that seemed completely unaffected by the metamorphosis. It was a place lush with nature. Green forests, tall mountains, and gently rushing rivers. It was almost a utopia. However, everyone knew that all of this terrain was purposely left here to make it even more difficult for prisoners to escape, not that they'd ever step foot out of the perimeter of Dark Cloud Prison, that is. The idea of an entire province being cornered off for a prison sounded insane. But, to summarize it not so many words, it was. Dark Cloud Prison was a massive hexagonal structure with a hollowed-out center. The rooms ringed the outside and thought they seemed to be open concept with plenty of windows. Everyone knew that even a missile wouldn't be capable of penetrating that glass. However, this was just the part of Dark Cloud Prison others could see. What many didn't know was that the hexagonal ring structure of Dark Cloud Prison dug deep underground for almost a kilometer, housing many more criminals than what met the eye. On one of these deepest floors, there was no sunlight to be seen, no open concept to marvel at, no nature to be in awe of. It was in this darkness that 2 guards walked, their steps uniform. Whose turn is it? One of them spoke. It should be time for prisoner #D1109. This guard was quite aware of how dangerous prisoners with the D prefix were. The only prisoners worthy of such a thing were dark prisoners. Yes. Since this is your first time, be cautious. Don't give him even a quarter of breathing space. Remember your training, this is not a joke. Do not be naive. The rookie guard nodded seriously. If he was one to take such matters lightly, he would have never been allowed this level of access. The 2 reached a dark cell door without so much as a small opening on it. After several procedures, they finally clicked open the heavy door as though it was a bank safe rather than a prison cell. The moment they did, an eerie chuckle reached their ears. #D1109? How inhumane. Why don't you call me by the name my mother gave me? Say it with me now. Lionel Morlise. Quite easy to say, don't you think? At that moment, Dark Cloud Prison suddenly quaked. It felt as though the world was collapsing. Chapter 5:14. Lionel took a look at the more than 200 men and women before him. The eldest was no more than 25, while the youngest might have been 16 or 17. But, all of them carried the experience of several battles. It was very clear that this wouldn't be their first stint. Though Lionel had the ability to do so, he didn't pick them based on their strength. He decided to choose randomly, not only to leave some face for Noah, but because he didn't particularly care how strong they were. Honestly, he didn't know why he agreed to Noah's proposal. It was more of an impulse than anything else. But, now that he had made his decision, there was no use in lamenting it. There was even something about it that filled him with a hint of excitement. His back stood just a bit straighter, his chest becoming just that small bit wider. The aura that surrounded his body caused them to fall in line, their expressions serious. "Who are the leaders amongst you?" Lionel finally spoke. The youths looked toward one another before a few stepped out. Among them, Lionel actually recognized one. Niall stood with a face even paler than Noah's had been. His arm was bandaged and wrapped. But, truthfully, there was no amount of bandages that could make up for a hole being blasted through your collarbone. It seemed as though someone had gone out of their way to secure his arm. As for whatever else was done, Lionel wasn't sure. After all, he wasn't trained in such things. All in all, there were 10 individuals including Niall who stepped out. Many of them had tired expressions. It was clear that it hadn't been too long since they conquered White City, but now, just when they thought they could finally go home, they were thrust into another matter. According to reports, Dark Cloud Prison had been attacked and at least 20% of the prison had been compromised, resulting in the sudden release of 23,329 C-grade prisoners, 12,802 B-grade prisoners, 2,023 grade prisoners and 103 dark prisoners. Though the complex terrain around Dark Cloud Prison was marketed as a method of making it tougher for prisoners to escape, if this was really the goal, then the area around the prison would be nothing but flat land. It would be next to impossible to escape if there was no cover to hide behind. The truth of it was that with the wristwatch the Empire gave every newborn, there was no need to worry too much about escape. The terrain actually functioned twofold. The first was maintaining at least somewhat of an eco-friendly environment on Earth that didn't involve the oceans. For the second reason, it was so that the public would forget such a place existed to begin with. Not only were there no paradise islands that traveled over Dark Cloud Province, but it was practically untouched by human hands with the exception of the massive prison at its very center. But now, this terrain had become a massive obstacle for them to overcome. None of this even mentioned the fact that whoever had attacked the prison had done so with the expressed purpose of releasing these prisoners. If this was the case, then that definitely meant that there was a high likelihood that these prisoners were being funneled into whatever army's terrain was building. Though the C and B grade prisoners weren't guaranteed to have high combat prowess, it was a different story for A and dark prisoners. The Empire had already found a strong correlation between how well one performed on their gene analysis exams and the strength of the abilities they could awaken. Dark prisoners had a better than 50% chance to be variants or stronger by this point. This was most definitely not something to be taken lightly. While weak worlds like Terrain mostly relied on their force cultivation to display strength, talented worlds like Earth could get away with having weaker foundations in such areas as long as their abilities were up to a certain standard. If it wasn't for the fact Noah had purposely chosen to hold back and Arthur had yet to learn how to control his ability, there was no way that City Lord White would have had such an easy time. However, with all of this said, the actions of Terrain were most definitely a double-edged sword. Taking advantage of the strength of these men and women would be one matter. But whether they would truly be able to control them was a different matter entirely. Lionel scanned the 10 before him. Other than Niall, there were 6 other young men and 3 young women. The weapons among them also varied greatly. While some chose to wield cold weapons, some had more modern weapons as well. These modern weapons were enhanced, but also didn't rely on advanced technology. After some inspection, Lionel realized that these modern weapons were actually treasures. Though they appeared to be of Earth's technology, they were much more like Lionel's first creations, the long nozzle pistols. Interesting. Lionel wondered if this was because other worlds had been observing Earth's technology to make these, or if maybe Earth's technology wasn't as unique as he once believed. Of course, there was another possibility, and that was that Earth had force crafters of its own that he was unaware of. If this last point was true, then it seemed that that mysterious grandfather of his had more hidden cards than it seemed. But, at the same time, a hidden card wouldn't be so hidden if it was out for all to see like this. So, Lionel dismissed the idea. It was more than likely a combination of the first two possibilities. 23 speed types. 19 defensive types. 21 attack types. 7 healing types. 48 body enhancement types. 39 force strengthening deviation types. 13 sensory types. 10 all-rounders. 74 unique, unclassifiable abilities. Lionel summarized quickly. Chapter 5:15. The 10 all-rounders were, of course, the 10 who stood before him. Their abilities separated from the unclassifiable abilities in that they had several strong points rather than one odd strong point. For example, among the 74, there was a young woman with an ability similar to King Arthur's. Except, rather than become streams of light, she became an odd liquid thicker than water. She could also coat her skin and her surroundings with this liquid to form a pseudo-domain of sorts that worked well for her. But, in a team battle, her uses were minimal. The defensive nature of her ability was only useful for her and couldn't truly be extended to others. At the same time, she wasn't a very good attacker either. In fact, she was weak in this regard. That said, if her ability was applied well, she would be among the strongest single combatants. Just trying to deal with her domain without slipping about wildly would be a headache even for Lionel. If he was in such a situation, he would be forced to use his surfboard and bombard her with arrows from above. He would stand little chance in normal hand-to-hand combat. However, the 10 youths that stood before Lionel were much different in this regard. Take Niall, for example. Niall seemed to have a short-ranged teleportation ability. If not for this, how could he have possibly intercepted Lionel on his way to Noah back then? But, his ability was actually more complex than this. It could be used not only to enhance his speed, but also in defense and attacking. He was able to displace not only himself in space, but also his spear and attacks aimed toward him. Of course, his manipulation of the extremely rare space force strengthening deviation was limited. But it was still among the reasons he was one of the most powerful combatants here. If it wasn't because he had faced Lionel, he wouldn't have lost so swiftly. With his ability alone, Niall could easily take responsibility for the safety of a 10-man party without hindering the abilities of those who were a part of his squad. This was the fundamental difference between him and the young girl. Since things are like this, I'll organize you as follows. The speed types will form 8 squads of 2 to 3. Your roles will be to maintain a perimeter around our troops in 8 directions and disrupting any forward momentum of any enemies you might run across. As for communication and the method of disruption, leave that to me. The remaining 200 or so of you, not including sensory types, healing types, or all-rounders, will form into squads of 10. The makeup of these squads will be 3 shield warriors, formed of either a defensive type or a body enhancement type, 3 assault units, formed of attack types and force strengthening deviation types, and finally 4 unique ability types. You 10 all-rounders, you will take the lead of 2 of these 10-man squads each. The remaining 20 of you, 7 healers and 13 sensory types will be responsible for both relaying my orders and maintaining the peak condition of the troop. Communication will be key. Lionel spoke all of these matters out in a single breath, not wasting any time. However, the youths before him couldn't help but wonder if Noah had given him information about them before. But, when they thought about how Lionel had randomly chosen them and how he hadn't seemed to be aware of the fact he would be gaining such troops to command beforehand, they couldn't help but be astonished. Could this be his ability? Or was it a treasure of some kind? What they didn't know was that it could technically be both for Lionel. He could use the dictionary to learn of their abilities. But, after the upgrade to his own, he found that making accurate guesses of the abilities of others had become much easier. Though he couldn't claim to comprehend as much detail as the dictionary had, it was definitely far less hazy than the past. Of course, he also saw that the more powerful the ability wielded by a person, the harder it was for him to see through it. But, this much was already far better than what most could accomplish. Lionel was definitely in a league of his own in this regard. Soon, Lionel had finished organizing the army and he walked up to Niall. "How much of your strength can you display right now?" Pale-faced, Niall still stood at attention. There wasn't a hint of hatred for Lionel in his eye. In fact, it now held the same respect it had for Noah. However, it was hard to tell if this was because Lionel had defeated him so easily, or if it was because he now knew that Lionel was a prince. It could only be said that if it was the latter, the brainwashing of the Empire was truly something to behold. "I can display about 20% of my strength, Your Highness," Niall replied seriously. Lionel's eyes sparkled. He hadn't asked this question because he wanted to know, but rather because he wanted to probe Niall's attitude. Seeing it, even he couldn't help but feel somewhat guilty. Golden lights surged around Lionel and descended upon Niall. The accumulation of light elemental force was so strong that it practically became blinding. Very quickly, Niall's face became more ruddy, his shallow breathing becoming deep and full once again. Under the shocked gazes of those spectating, Niall's state continuously became better. When Lionel lowered his hand, though Niall wasn't back to peak condition, he was clearly much better. It wouldn't be an issue for him to display 80% of his strength. Niall's eyes widened. "Thank you, Your Highness." Lionel smiled and waved a hand. "I won't apologize for what I did because that would be hypocritical. Truthfully, if you stood in my way again, I would treat you the same way." Niall paled somewhat hearing these words, but he inwardly felt more respect for Lionel after hearing them. He didn't want to be treated like a dog who could be coddled with a carrot and a stick. He wasn't a person that a bad guy, good guy routine could work on. Such a thing would only be effective for those who were weak of mind. But, those are matters of the past. We all have the same goal right now, and that's to repel these invaders. Niall nodded seriously, his back standing somewhat straighter. "From now on, don't call me Your Highness or Prince, call me Captain. What I value most are two things, respect and persistence. Respect for your fellow man and woman. Give everything you have to them and prepare to receive everything they have in return. Persist for your fellow warriors. Give everything you have and expect nothing." Lionel scanned the organized group of youths before him, his aura towering. He looked more like a sturdy pillar, prepared to hold up even the skies rather than a simple young man. The blood of the youths involuntarily boiled. From indifference, their faces somewhat reddened, their hearts beating a step faster. Respect with your all and expect everything. Persist with your all and expect nothing. Respect was a mindset. Persistence was an action. The meaning of it all was simple. If you gave your heart and bled on the battlefield, it was only right that you expect the same. If you gave your soul and died on the battlefield, it was only right you expect nothing. These words were suddenly engraved onto their souls. Chapter 5:16. Dark Cloud Prison descended into mania. One of the 6 sections completely collapsed, leaving a scene one thought should have been a catastrophe. But, while some did indeed die, the resulting explosion was rather controlled. It was obvious to any third-party observer that this was all planned, down to the final dotted I and crossed T, ho ho ho. Lionel chuckled. Author's note, from now on, whenever referring to Lionel, I will write it as Lionel. They are pronounced the same, so it should help with the flow of the story. But, do keep in mind that this Lionel has a name spelled and said the exact same way as our favorite MC. Lionel sat on the damp cell floor, his arms wrapped around his body. Of course, this wasn't by choice. The straitjacket they forced him to stay in was made of materials far tougher than Kevlar. As though that wasn't enough, it was reinforced with several locks and chains. Even if he wanted to unwind his arms, he didn't have the luxury. One would think that they would at least let him out to take a shower, but he didn't have this luxury either. Rather, every time the stink got to be too much, they'd bathe him in UV-type light and send him on his way. The result of this treatment for almost 2 decades now was a man who smelt somewhat like one part vegetable left to dry beneath the sun for too long and another part cured meat. In the darkness, it was hard to see his face at all. Or, rather, he had a habit of speaking with his head lowered, his messy hair covering much of his face. However, if the guards had a choice, they'd prefer him to keep his head lowered just like this. So close. Lionel continued to chuckle. If that blast was 2% stronger, I would be free. What a shame, what a shame. The rookie guard felt a cold chill at the back of his neck, the ground still trembling beneath their feet. What? The rookie guard began to speak, but his next words were caught in his throat when he saw the unsightly expression on his partner's face. What is it? The rookie suddenly entered high alert, his hand hovering over his weapon. The veteran guard took deep breaths, trying to calm himself, his gaze never leaving Lionel. If others saw his actions, they would think that he was insane. Why he was so focused on a man who couldn't move an inch, maybe only those of Dream Cloud Prison would know. Listen, rookie. Back away slowly. Stay on high alert. If needed, don't hold back. The rookie guard's pupils constricted. You mean? Yes. Do whatever is necessary. A cold shiver traveled up the rookie's spine, his muscles tensing. The first thing any new guards of Dark Cloud Prison were taught was the importance of information. This wasn't a lesson about learning as much as you could. No, it was a lesson in keeping as much of it away from these prisoners as possible. Dark prisoners were incarcerated from the time they were toddlers to the day of their deaths. Most couldn't even remember a world outside of these walls. In fact, their only interactions with the world should have been at these moments where food was brought to them. Any understanding of language these prisoners had should have been from their short time as members of society, in fact, that went for all their understandings. With all this said, there was one matter in particular that they wanted to keep from these prisoners, the metamorphosis. Those prisoners that became invalids were silently killed. There weren't any paradise islands above Dark Cloud Province. Even guards were diligently trained in combat without their abilities. From day one of training, they were drilled in the fact that use of one's abilities should be a final resort. Yet now, the veteran guard was saying to use any means necessary. The rookie's breathing couldn't help but grow shallow, a cold sweat slowly trickling down his forehead. Tsk. Is there a need for such caution? Didn't I already say it was a shame? The veteran's jaw steeled. How did you learn about percentages? #D1109. Lionel paused for a moment before his laughter returned, stronger than before. His hair dangled across his face, vibrating to his cadence. The veteran guard's countenance became more chilly, still taking slow steps back. Oops, my tongue must have slipped. Aya, what else can you expect from me? My street smarts are still a bit lacking, I've seen too little of the world. Where did you hear the name Lionel Morales from? The guard continued coldly, trying to buy time for the rookie to inch away and report this matter to the warden. Lionel froze. But this time, his laughter didn't come. An eerie silence hung over the cell as the ground continued to rumble. Where did I hear it? From the lips of my own mother before you ripped me away from her and threw me into this place. The voice didn't carry any sort of emotion to the point it sounded somewhat mechanical, as though it was an automated message rather than the words of a human. The veteran and rookie froze. Fear the likes of which they had never experienced in their lifetimes took hold of their hearts, clenching it tightly. Blood flew, splashing against the walls. The crimson sparkled in the darkness, looking like the wings of a fallen angel. Warden. Warden. The rumbling of the prison's framework couldn't stop the booming of this voice. A mixture of panic, shock and horror laced it, coloring the roar with emotion. Within an office on the lowest floor of Dark Cloud Prison, one could find the warden. He was a man of average height but broad presence. His graying mustache hung over his lip with the thickness of a forest's bush. His every breath was deep and unfathomable. If one paid attention, it would be easy to notice that every cycle of inhaling and exhaling took a full minute to complete. Yet, this warden completed it with absolute ease. At that moment, the warden was shirtless. Despite his old age, his body rippled with strength, his torso having a level of tone that left men half his age in shame. A healthy bronze sheen glistened across his skin, making him look more like a fitness model rather than the warden of a prison. This man was none other than Governor Duke Escobar Owen. Before the shouting guard could even reach the office, Escobar put on his black military uniform, hiding his toned body, and opened the door, his demeanor steely and indifferent. Warden. #D1109 has escaped. If Lionel had been there, he would have immediately recognized this warden. He was none other than Coach Owen, a man Lionel respected almost as much as his own father. Chapter 5:17. Coach Owen's expression solidified. Of all of them, why did it have to be him? The words the warden spoke were hardly audible. In fact, in his panic, the guard across from him didn't seem to pick up on the oddity either. Seeing the sorry performance of the person that was supposed to be his right-hand man, Escobar snorted, his thick mustache rustling. "Get yourself together." The low shout snapped the lead guard into attention, his heels slamming together as his back arched as though a string had been pulled from the top of his head. "Gather the men," Escobar said coldly. "We're going hunting." "Yes, sir." The lead guard spun and jetted off, his speed beyond normal human limits. Escobar watched this with narrowed eyes, inwardly lamenting the state the metamorphosis had put his best man in. Though the ability awakened by his lead guard, Garwin, was especially powerful, it left his personality somewhat warped. Garwin was able to control the balance of hormones and neurotransmitters in his body. The good news was that much like Aina, he could very easily train his body to surpass its limits even without outside influences. In fact, he was better than even Aina in some ways, because while Aina was limited in simply making her body stronger, Garwin could strengthen his mind and thinking speed as well. However, there were major downsides to Garwin's ability as well. Oftentimes, the more powerful an ability, the more complex it was and the more difficult it was to control. On top of this, in order to maximize his ability, Garwin had to come up with many unique use cases for it, much like Lionel had to, or like Simeon with his gene manipulation ability. The more difficult an ability was to control, the more potential pitfalls there were. Though Lionel had yet to run into any on his own, Garwin hadn't been so lucky. Because of how sensitive his abilities were, his hormones could easily be set out of whack, causing him to react inappropriately to many situations. In the past, he had been a man no less stoic than Governor Duke Owen. But, after the metamorphosis, his emotions were more varied and unpredictable. However, he was simply too important to Dark Cloud Prison. His fighting capabilities were even beyond Governor Duke Owen's now. This was something the warden had no choice but to admit. If they wanted to place these criminals back where they belonged, Garwin would have to be a key cog. The warden walked back into his office, finding a particular cabinet of files and opening it. His expression became more somber the more he flipped, but his pace didn't accelerate, only remaining even from start to finish. Finally, he landed on a particular file by the title of #D1109. The first picture he saw in the file was of a baby with large pale green eyes. The small boy had a small button nose and messy dirty blonde hair. All in all, he was an adorable child. But, there was something off about the photo. The longer one stared at it, the more uncomfortable you would feel. The longer one looked, the less this baby boy appeared to be a baby boy at all. The warden had lost count of how many times he had stared at this photo, but it wasn't until recently that he realized what was so off about it all. It was the eyes. This baby's eyes didn't have the innocent light of a child nor the curious nature of a newborn. Rather, its gaze was vacant, continuously staring back at you as though it already had everything figured out. Coach Owen sighed. The rest of the document was filled with redactions. Place of birth, parenthood, even the date of birth was crossed. There was nothing but this picture and the prisoner's code. Nothing more, nothing else. So similar, the warden couldn't help but feel that his life's work was nothing but garbage. Only he and a few select people knew the truth of these matters, but what he did know left him feeling cold. Your resentment, I understand it. However, I cannot allow you to do as you please. It seems that I will need to kill you with my own hands. The warden put the file away, locking the cabinet as Dark Cloud Prison continued to tremble. Then, he turned and walked out of his office, his mustache bristling. Scouting units, move out. Lionel commanded. The speed types jetted out in 8 different directions, each of them leaving blazing trails of wind in their wake. To the back of the troop, there was a large, lingering mountain range. Since Earth had long since mastered terraforming technology, allowing the continents to come together to form a single supercontinent, it also took advantage of this technology to make Dark Cloud Province as inaccessible as possible. As a result, there were only 2 paths to enter this province that didn't include the sky. The Northern Passage and the Southern Passage. Noah and Lionel had split into 2 groups, each manning one of the passages. Lionel was tasked with bringing support from the south. According to what Lionel understood, Dark Cloud Province already had its own forces, obviously. They were simply bringing support. In addition, it would be their job to capture any escapees once the situation was settled. Aside from this, they would have to worry about the forces of terrain that had been sent to this location, which should include the forces of Hargrove City. Lionel took the vanguard of the army with Aina by his side. She held onto her great sword, a serious light hidden behind the slits of her mask. The forest was quite dense. Moving in such a large group would make things difficult, so Lionel took advantage of the 10-man squads he had formed and had them fan out. It would be difficult to fight any large-scale battles in this place, but that also went for the enemy as well. With the makeup of the squads, it would be much easier for them to deal with issues. At that moment, Lionel's gaze suddenly sharpened. As expected. Just a few seconds after Lionel had the thought, a communication talisman lit up by his side and entered his ears silently. Captain, Squad Northwest has detected the movement of enemy scouts. They number 7. Standing by for orders. It was impossible for terrain to not also be aware that there were only 2 entry paths to Dark Cloud Province. In that case, how could they not erect their own blockades to stop incoming reinforcements? Chapter 518. Lionel sent a gaze toward Aina only to find her already looking back toward him. With a light nod, they shot forward as one, their steps light and in sync. The remainder of the troops continued to advance slowly. Though they exchanged some glances about the oddity of it all, they didn't make any other movements. Something like a commander taking the vanguard was practically unheard of, at least in Earth's modern history. However, Lionel had made his plan to them clear. A count of 250 wasn't a lot, especially in a war of this scale. Where their benefit lay is in the fact they were all elite warriors, all capable of battling 2 to 3 on their own. In such a case, not only was such a forest the best terrain for them, but it also presented a unique opportunity to flip this war on its head. Lionel's lips moved, but no one seemed to hear what he said at all. However, several hundred meters away, the Northwest squad had already jumped into action. Despite the high sun, the forest was still drenched in shadows. From below the high canopies, it felt more like a cloudy day than anything else. Unfortunately, unlike a cloudy day, the forest floor was quite humid. Any normal human of the 3rd dimension would be leaking sweat by this point. Luckily, though, Earth was still in its infant stages as a new 4th-dimensional world. As such, the harsher climates of a world at this stage had yet to come to fruition. However, even still, the hot temperatures were slowly creeping upward and breaking records that had withstood the test of centuries, while the cold temperatures were doing the same. It wouldn't be long before Earth began to face extremes it never had before. While there was this bad news, though, there was also good news. In this transition period, zones wouldn't begin to appear just yet. So, Earth had a small level of reprieve. But, it might have been exactly because of this that terrain chose to attack now. At that moment, on the humid forest floor, a group of 7 moved forward cautiously along their patrol path, their senses on high alert. They wore red robes accented by bright yellow flexible armor. The design made them look like small boiling suns of their own, but judging by the small beads of sweat falling down their brow, this had little to do with their affinities. The lead of the 7 men suddenly snapped his head in a certain direction, just in time to see a small orb of light land in their midst. A hint of panic colored his features. But, just when he was frozen in horror, the small globe of light pulsed, sending out a halo that covered a 10-meter radius. Without hesitation, the lead scout pulled out a talisman and ripped it. The talisman was torn in two, causing a flare of flames to light it quickly. The sparks coalesced, concentrating into a bead and shooting up into the skies. But, just as it was about to break past, it rammed into the halo of light. One would have expected a bang, but the reality was much less fantastical. The spark fizzled out, drooping back down to the ground as though it had run out of oxygen to fuel itself. The lead scout's eyes widened. He opened his mouth and roared at the top of his lungs. His shout was so loud that the 6 that followed him covered their ears, clenching their jaws. The lead scout relaxed when he completed this action, his unsettled emotions resting into a sneer. He slowly pulled out twin daggers that rested on his hips. He felt that everything was over now. Now that they knew that Earth had indeed sent reinforcements, it would be a matter of absolute ease for them to be surrounded and killed one by one. Earth didn't have technology anymore, so sending in reinforcements through the air was almost impossible. There was no way they had aerial units prepared already. And, even if they did, there was no way they could match the units terrain had scouting up above. So, they would have no choice but to send ground troops. But, in such a thick forest, how many could they really send? If they were smart, they would send a small unit of elites with a few trump cards. That orb of light was clearly one of Earth's trump cards, but it also displayed Earth's naivete. There was more to contend with than just tools. If Earth couldn't come up with methods of countering a variety of abilities as well, they would be finished. This was the perfect example. They were prepared to stop their signal flare, but they had no method of stopping his shout. The lead scout's sneer deepened. What a fledgling world. It's clear you don't deserve these lands, so well be happy to take it off your hands. It was at that exact moment that Lionel and Aina appeared. They weaved through the trees, one wielding a great sword and the other flipping his palm to take out a pitch-black bow. Aina continued to shoot forward while Lionel leapt up agilely. His feet rebounded off the tough bark of the trees, sending him flying upward. He left a trail of gold in his wake. And, for but a moment, his arms seemed to have unfurled into the wings of a bird. Behind her beautiful icy blue-white mask, Aina crossed the final barrier into the halo of light, her sword trailing behind her like the tail of a comet. A little girl? Is this a joke? The lead scout almost couldn't rein in his laughter. Fine, I'll pry that little mask off you and see what kind of beauty it's hiding. Lionel lightly stepped onto a branch over 15 meters above the ground. With swift motions, he knocked 6 arrows at once, a cold, calculating glint in his eye. By the time Aina prepared to swing her sword toward the lead scout, he had already pulled his bowstring back. Even after reaching the 4th dimension in his physique, Lionel could only pull his bowstring back just over 50% of the way, displaying the furious strength of this bow quite clearly. But 50% was still almost overkill. Shoo! Lionel released 6 arrows at once just as Aina swung her sword toward the lead scout. At that moment, the lead scout's expression finally changed. The difference was too stark, how could he miss it? In one instant, he couldn't hear the whistling of Aina's sword or the shocking charge of Lionel's arrows. But in the next moment, it barraged his senses as though they wouldn't allow him to focus on anything else. No. Unfortunately, it was too late for the lead scout to understand that his first instinct should have been to run. Chapter 5:19. Lionel's arrow pierced 6 skulls as Aina's sword split the lead scout in two. Lionel leapt down to the ground, the the soil shifting beneath his heavy fall. It worked well, Aina said. But, it still has some flaws. Lionel nodded in agreement. A smarter scout would have realized they couldn't hear anything much quicker. We got lucky this time because this one is used to having his hearing compromised, but it won't necessarily happen again. With the way he and Aina were charging through the forest, no matter how light their steps were, it was impossible for them to not have made a single sound. A smarter scout would have realized very quickly that the barrier Lionel erected could both block their signal flares and any sound they made. Once they realized this, their first instinct would have been to run rather than holding their ground. After all they had to do was leave the 10-meter radius of the halo to send out a signal. Even if they couldn't survive, it was their role as scouts to send such valuable information back. But, luckily, ironically due to his shouting ability, the lead scout's hearing was compromised along with the 6 that followed him. So, he didn't notice the oddity until it was too late. Is it possible to make the sound filter one way? Aina asked. It's possible, but it would double the production time. With the time crunch we're on, I'm not sure if it's worth it. Lionel was the only one who could make these orbs of light. And, unfortunately, they were one-use objects with a very limited lifespan. Which meant that he would have to make a new one for each one of these operations. The Northwest squad came out of their hiding places, displaying speed that even surpassed Lionel and Aina. At least, it surpassed the speed they had displayed to this point. It seemed that this squad was quite capable, indeed. Captain. Lionel nodded. Right, this region is still your responsibility. Lionel raised a hand and caused a surge of fire elemental force to burn the 7 corpses before him. The halo of light pulsed, causing the scent of burning flesh to be purified and dispersed. With that, Lionel and Aina shot back toward the main group. The members of Northwest Squad looked at one another with deep meaning in their eyes. It had been them who threw out the orb on Lionel's command to begin with, so they were an integral part of the operation. They had to say that they were surprised by the efficiency. If things continued like this, they would have a good chance of performing well. This was enough to tell them that though their styles were different, Lionel's leadership ability was no less than Noah's. But, where they separated was in the usefulness of Lionel's skills. While their leadership abilities didn't differ by much, Lionel's skill as a force crafter made his plans work out with much more smoothness and ease. Their lives hadn't even been on the line even once, yet 7 enemies had died. It was truly baffling. With a light nod to one another, the 3 members of Northwest Squad shot in different directions, their eyes flashing with more determination. At that moment outside of Dark Cloud Prison, an odd scene could be seen. On one side, there was a hexagonal prison. But, on another, there was a city that seemed to have dropped out of the skies. Of the 6 sides of this hexagonal prison, one had completely collapsed. And, this collapsed portion just happened to be the section facing the out-of-place city. For any third-party observer, it was easy to deduce what happened. This city fell from the skies and caused the damage they were now seeing. But, what was maybe more surprising was that even with such a disastrous event occurring, the prison only lost a 1/6 of its integrity. If Lionel could see this sight, he would be shocked beyond belief before marveling at Earth's ability. Camelot was almost upturned by the fall of just one city. Yet, despite the city having fallen not even half a kilometer from Dark Cloud Prison, it only suffered the collapse of a single side. However, at that moment, there was nothing the guards and warden of Dark Cloud Prison felt happy about. With the prison compromised, a large swath of prisoners found the light of day for the first time in decades. What they didn't know was that the restrictions of Dark Cloud Prison went beyond just walls and bars. The very materials of the prison was capable of blocking influxes of force. This caused even those who successfully managed to awaken their abilities to have little chance at sensing and using them. This technology went beyond force disruption towers. Even with the descent of the 4th dimension, it was completely unaffected because it relied on metals from the 4th dimension itself. As for whether or not terrain was aware of this fact, it was unknown. But, what was certain was that with the collapse of the prison, this system was compromised. While these special metals were effective in some cases, they also had far more limitations than force disruption towers. Simply being in their vicinity wasn't enough. One had to be enclosed by them or in contact with them. In addition, just like how force disruption towers were useless in the fourth dimension, these metals were useless against abilities in the fifth dimension and above. Due to this, the appearance of the city caused many prisoners who hadn't been aware of their abilities in the past to suddenly become enlightened, causing chaos to reign. The sound of battle filled the halls of the prison, leaking out through its cracked and falling walls. But this would soon be the least of their worries. City Lord Hargrove, a slender man with a drooping gray mustache that swept past his chest, stood atop the city wall, eyeing the prison as though he saw prey. Prisoners of Dark Cloud. His voice suddenly boomed, reverberating through the collapsed walls. Do you want your freedom? Do you want revenge? The Empire of Earth has done nothing but take from you. Do you want to make them pay? Do you want to see the capital washed in blood? Do you want to see the head of Emperor Fox on a pike? Join us. Chapter 520. Archers. City Lord Hargrove's voice boomed once more. In one moment, there was no one but this singular, seemingly frail, city lord to be found on the city's walls. But, in the next moment, 2 rows of over 100 archers appeared, each with the light of an expert in their eyes. It became clear very quickly that Hargrove had no intention charging into the prison. Why would he undertake such a thankless task? No, his goal was simple. Any guards or wardens that escaped this prison would find an arrow between the eye. As for the prisoners, they would be welcomed with open arms. The prisoners of Earth provided 2 opportunities. Not only would they give a large influx of talented individuals, but they would also be able to gain the same number in 5th-generational persons. This killed 2 birds with just a single stone. The only large clearing one could find on Dark Cloud Province was in this very place. About a kilometer around the hexagonal prison was nothing but flat concrete. With the appearance of Hargrove City, this concrete was now filled with spiderweb-like cracks, but it served its purpose to perfection. Without any place to hide, how could the guards of Dark Cloud Prison possibly protect themselves against the assault of 100 elite archers? At that moment, a head peeked out from behind the rubble. Dust and soot covered this person's face, making it difficult to tell if they were male or female at first glance. It seemed that whoever this person was, they had chosen to shave their head bald. When this prisoner saw the rows of archers in the distance, they panicked and ducked back down. However, they soon calmed. If Lionel had been there, he would be shocked to realize that he recognized this person. It was none other than the younger brother of the demoted vice-commander of the Slayer Legion, Damien. There's a massive city that appeared out of nowhere. Damien reported to the prisoners that had followed behind him. They have 100 archers all primed and ready. Among them, there were a few who had attacked on that day, including his elder brother, Joseph. One would think that as members of the most notorious group of rebels, they would have been thrown into a much deeper part of Dark Cloud Prison. But their allocations showed just how much disregard the Empire had for their efforts as a whole. Despite having once been a vice-commander of the Slayer Legion, Joseph, even as the highest-rated prisoner among them, was still a mere C-grade prisoner, just like the rest of them. In truth, such treatment had hurt more than anything else. They would rather have been treated like the lowliest of scum, been underfed, beaten and abused. But what they actually got was a cushy cell, 3 meals a day, and a psychiatrist to vent to. It felt as though they were children put on timeout rather than criminals who had risked their lives every day for the sake of forging a better future for themselves. This had been an insult worse than anything they had ever experienced before, and that sort of treatment made their hatred of the Empire burn even more fervently. And along with that, their hatred of Lionel increased proportionally. When Damien's whispers reached their ears, the prisoners panicked somewhat. The truth was that most of them weren't hardened criminals. Aside from those who were from the Slayer Legion, the rest had only committed petty crimes. Facing such a situation, many of them weren't sure how to react. Knowing this, there was no wonder those of the Slayer Legion felt so insulted. They were placed in the same cells as men and women whose worst crime might have been trespassing onto the wrong property or shoplifting. The only difference between them and the Slayer Legion members was that while they would get out, those of the Slayer Legion would be here for life. Until now. This definitely isn't a decoy. Joseph spoke, his expressions much less cheery as compared to the past. Even if the Empire wanted to con us, they wouldn't destroy the prison to do so, and they definitely wouldn't dare to speak ill of Emperor Fox toward that end. It's more than likely that those archers are there to act as our cover. But should we really trust them and go? We have no idea who these people are, they haven't announced their affiliations. Damien said slowly. The only reason Damien and Joseph had been so quick to attempt to escape despite understanding the iron fist that was the Empire was because they thought that maybe the Slayer Legion was finally taking large-scale action. The truth was that before Damien and Joseph chose to take a maddened attempt at conquering Royal Blue Fort, the Slayer Legion was prepping for something. As for what they were planning, the brothers couldn't be sure. But they felt as though they would be left behind if they didn't take a massive leap forward. Obviously, their attempt failed, but now they were hoping that this matter was related to the Slayer Legion. However, if it truly was, then why wouldn't they announce this? From start to finish, Hargrove didn't mention their origins, something that made the brothers feel antsy about trusting such an unknown entity. No matter what, they weren't fools. As the first prisoners to make it to this opening, they had obviously been on the highest floors. As such, the level of torture they had suffered in this prison could be considered to be null. They simply weren't as desperate as those A and dark prisoners. So, they were far more clear-minded at this moment. Joseph hesitated, finding his brother's words to be true. At this point, he no longer held the decisiveness he had in the past. The man bold enough to target a fort of the Empire as a mere vice-commander was no longer here. Damien's gaze flashed with a hint of rage looking at the shell of a man his brother had become, but he didn't say anything else. At this point, maybe the elder brother he once knew would never come back. At that moment, though, a resonating laughter shook the collapsed halls. Bang! A man shot up from a floor below, crashing through the walls and jetting out of the prison. Freedom! His roar was so loud that even the concrete beneath his feet splintered even more. The man's gaze locked onto the city in the distance. Take down the Empire? The Emperor's head on a pike? I'm not sure what this Empire is or who this Emperor is, but he'll take you up on your offer anyway. An uproarious laughter shook Dark Cloud Province. Chapter 521. The man looked massive, something that was inconceivable considering the level of security he would have had to live under for his entire life. He wore a gray uniform with a single zipper that went from his collar to his crotch. On his left chest, a bright red tag shone, #D2901. The air around this man seemed to grow solid, a palpable killing intent hanging heavily around him. It shouldn't have been possible for even a grade prisoner to become so large, let alone a dark prisoner. Their meals were perfectly measured to maintain health and prevent starvation, but it shouldn't have been enough to feed their strength, let alone growing to have such a muscular body. There was no doubt that whatever ability this man had, his strength was related to it. City Lord Hargrove's expression flickered. He doesn't know what the Empire is? Or who the Emperor is? Interesting, it seems that we've underestimated just how villainous this Ascension Empire is. Hargrove should have known. Any empire that dared to name itself Ascension had to be arrogant without regard. There was a reason those of the dimensional verse described the evolution of a world as the descent of a dimension. It was supposed to represent a bestowal by the universe. Whether it be the talent or potential of a world, it was all gifted. A world didn't grow to accept an evolution, rather an evolution fell upon a certain world. This was the subtle difference. This was the core truth behind dimensional descent. Yet, whether by coincidence or by a lofty purpose, Earth's empire named itself Ascension. Arrogance didn't even begin to describe such bloviating. It almost made Hargrove laugh and rage. As a man born in a world with such little talent, he understood this bestowal the most. Yet, this Earth, despite being lucky enough to be gifted such prospects, actually believed that they could snub their noses at it. Hargrove raised his head, a billowing laughter leaving his lips. His long mustache caught a wind, whipping about wildly along with the rest of his hair. His hands clasped behind his back, his chest standing wide and broad. "We accept one and all." #D2901 laughed when he heard these words. His legs flexed, the ground beneath him cracking once again. Bang! He shot into the skies, crossing a 50-meter length in a single bound. Just as he was making his way through, another group of prisoners charged out. Damien, Joseph, and the others could no longer wait. This wasn't because they decided to trust these people, but rather because the appearance of this man had sent the guards into a frenzy. The guards at their level of security was minimal. After the destruction of the prison, Damien could use his ability again. As a person who had an S-grade ability upon awakening, his ability had long since crossed into the 5th dimension now. So, defeating a few low-level guards had been especially easy. But, they weren't fools. They knew that the guards on the lower levels were no laughing matter. If they couldn't leave now, they might never leave. As expected, the moment Damien, Joseph, and the others bolted out of their hiding spots, running full speed for the city in the distance, the first guard appeared. Unable to wield their normal weapons any longer, they wielded cold weapons. However, their actions didn't seem awkward in the slightest. It seemed that they were most definitely well trained in the regard. One prisoner after another poured out. It was clear that #D2901 had carved out a path for them all. The maddening howls of laughter shook the prison, causing a cold shiver to take hold of C and B grade prisoners. They had all heard stories about how insane the prisoners below were. It was impossible for them to spend so many decades within these walls and not see certain oddities. However, after seeing these men and women for themselves, they all realized one thing. They were insane. Many of them, clearly unused to walking on their own 2 feet, ran on all fours. Some rolled about as though they were balls rather than humans. A few chose to walk on their hands, shooting off toward Hargrove City in a mad dash. The normal prisoners amongst them, wearing #CS and #BS across their chests, had never felt such fear in their lives. They gathered into groups, hoping that they wouldn't lose their lives in a maddened assault. A young acrobatic woman charged through the concrete on her palms. Her concept of the world were so shallow that she didn't seem to understand shame at all. Her prison garbs were completely unzipped and her small breasts hung out, jiggling about as she planted her palms one after another. Her head peeked upward as she curiously observed the fear in the eyes of the normal prisoners by Damien's side. She had never seen such emotion before. She wondered where it was coming from. It looked like fun. She effortlessly kept up with them on her hands despite the fact they were running with all their might. It was quite baffling, actually. Unlike dark prisoners, C and B grade prisoners got to exercise every day. By right, they should be more fit than she was. The young woman looked curiously at a slightly obese man at the back of the group. He lingered behind the group, finding it hard to keep up. The obese man seemed to feel something observing him. But, when he locked eyes on the vacant gaze of the woman chasing after him on her hands, he felt as though his heart had been thrown into an ice bath. His throat constricted and his trouble breathing became even worse. The young woman tilted her head, her speed not slowing in the slightest. At that moment, her vacant expression twisted into a slanted smile. She looked as though she had never smiled a day in her life before. The facial muscles she should have been using only half worked, leaving her face somewhat crooked. She suddenly pushed off the ground, her hands landing on the obese man's shoulders. Her breasts dangled atop his head. But, the scene that should have been one part erotic and another part comedic didn't feel like this for the obese man at all. Help. Help me. Damien and Joseph looked back, only to hear a giggle that shook their very souls. The young woman slapped the chubby cheeks of the obese man, twisting into the air without letting go. At first, the obese man's body followed her momentum. But, very soon, it couldn't. The result was a head being ripped from its body, its voice being cut off halfway in favor of gurgling blood. The young woman landed on the ground, still pushing off her palms. But the obese man's head, as though a soccer ball rather than part of a human's corpse, danced on the soles of her feet, hopping from one to the other. Chapter 522. Damien and Joseph looked back in horror, their eyes widening in shock. What should have been a frail young woman suddenly became a monster in their eyes. There was nothing about her innocent expression that left them with any sort of ease any longer. The amount of torque you would need to twist a human's head off, let alone from such an odd position, was enough to make them shiver down to their cores. This young woman looked no different from any other in her early 20s. Yet, the strength she displayed was beyond the realms of reason. "Keep running," Joseph barked. The young woman continued to observe the running group, her breathing hiccuping into a bubbling giggle every so often. It was as though she had overexerted her body, but her brain had yet to register the fact. It short-circuited, trying to decide whether she should prioritize laughing or breathing deeply. Damien and the others entered a state of high alert. It was at that moment that the guards began to flood out of the cracked walls one after another, some quickly catching up to some of the prisoners who hadn't spent their time escaping but rather on other matters. But it was then that the first arrows were released. It was so swift that it didn't even make a single sound beneath the chorus of excited roars and insane laughter. A guard who had just snapped the arm of a prisoner while twisting their limb back suddenly found a bloody hole between their brows. The prisoner blinked with curiosity, crimson splattering all over his face. His tongue whipped out, tagging the corner of his lip. He spit out the blood as soon as he tasted it, finding it not too pleasing. Then, without much thought, he snapped his arm back into place and continued running with everyone else, curiosity lighting his eyes. Despite the fact he had just seen a person die for the first time in his life, he didn't seem to feel any particularly special way about it. It was a complete slaughter. Every guard that stepped into the clearing was instantly sniped. The precision of the Hargrove City archers seemed to be even beyond the elite snipers of Earth. They acted as though in tacit agreement, not wasting a single arrow. Earth was very quickly finding out that there were some matters far more important than just talent. While the people of Earth were fighting to protect their home, the people of Terrain were fighting for their futures. Not just their own futures, but that of their families and loved ones. Losing was not an option. Hundreds of prisoners made their way across the clearing, their confidence growing with each passing moment. The efficiency of the archers gave them this very confidence to the point where many began to smile. They finally saw an end to their nightmare. Of course, those smiling individuals weren't among the madmen designated with AS and DS across their chests. There were no small number of C and B grade prisoners who lost their lives at their hands. City Lord, is it really alright to let things continue like this? Every City Lord had a right-hand man. For City Lord White, it had been the secretary, Naya. For City Lord Hargrove, it was an elder man who seemed even older than the skinny, graying City Lord. This older man, dressed quite like a butler, was known as Salnas. Hargrove continued to observe the situation, not answering immediately. In response, Salnas couldn't help but press again. There's clearly a reason why Earth decided to lock many of them away. Though they're clearly very powerful, they've all lost their minds. How can we expect to control them? They might end up being our downfall instead. Salnas finished, his tone somewhat somber. Though he spoke these words, in order to ensure that his actions wouldn't dampen the morale of the men, he controlled his voice so that only the City Lord could hear him. After all, every small advantage they could grab a hold of was a plus. They couldn't allow Earth the slightest chink in their armor. Salnas, I think it's best you don't ask for answers to questions you aren't qualified to have. The sudden indifferent voice caught Salnas off guard. He felt as though a blade was suddenly firmly pressed against his back, prepared to take his life at the slightest sign of impropriety. Salnas gulped, his frail old body shivering. Yes, young heir Anared. I apologize, I've stepped out of line. Salnas struggled to speak through gritted teeth, the beating of his heart growing erratic. Even to now, he didn't dare to turn around to face Anared, who had most definitely appeared behind him. He simply lowered his head, trying to stop the trembling of his body. When did this child grow so powerful? Salmas felt as though Anared could take his life whenever he pleased. But, logically, this young heir who was nothing more than a little boy in Salma's eyes should have still been several decades away from displaying such strength. However, when Salmas thought of a certain possibility, his trembling only became worse. Hargrove frowned slightly and swept a gaze back in Anared's direction. Something like reprimanding another subordinate was definitely crossing a line of respect. It was even worse that Anared had actually been listening in on what should have been a private conversation. In any other situation, this would have led to a battle of city lords. But, even Hargrove seemed to feel some trepidation when facing Anared now. Just when Hargrove made the choice to swallow his pride and was about to try to alleviate the tension with some words, the ground quaked. Are they finally getting serious? Hargrove turned his frown toward Dark Cloud Prison. He knew well that Earth wouldn't leave this place unprotected. This prison was too much of a strategic point. In fact, even Terrain was aware of this, or else Anared would have never been sent here. The portions of the hexagonal prison that appeared above ground suddenly collapsed. No. They didn't collapse, rather, they sunk into the ground, being swallowed beneath the concrete. Just after this happened, the hollow center that the prison once surrounded opened, separating like the jaws of a hidden beast. A platform slowly raised. At first, it was impossible to see anything atop of it. But, very soon, the shadows of men and women became clear. By the time the platform's gears grinded to a halt and appeared above ground, one could see a troop of over 10,000 warriors led by lead guard Garwin and Governor Duke Owen. Chapter 523. Joseph and Damien looked back after hearing the clicking of the gears. They had put their all into running and avoiding the and dark prisoners around them, but hearing such a loud commotion, they couldn't help themselves. When they saw the sudden appearance of the Dark Cloud prison guards, and in such a large number at that, they felt as though their legs couldn't carry them fast enough. There was just half a kilometer between them and the city gates. To well-trained men like them, even before the metamorphosis, this was a matter of a 2 or 3 minute run at most. Yet, these few minutes felt like the longest they had experienced in their lifetimes. Escobar scanned the situation emotionlessly. It was as though he couldn't see the archers aiming their bows toward him. His gaze landed on each and every one of the guards that had fallen, the billowing of his mustache becoming deeper with each passing moment. Even with the long cycles of his breath, it felt as though the wind around the warden was kicking up, responding to his will in large swaths. Mow them down. He commanded coldly. At that moment, the clicking of guns sounded. City Lord Hargrove's pupils constricted. That's impossible. Heavy military boots stepped forward before they each kneeled, pressing their rifles to their shoulders. And then, the bullets rained. As quickly as the guards had fallen, the prisoners fell even faster. How could the fire rate of archers match the pace of semi-automatic weaponry? Shit! Damien growled, his feet stamping against the ground. A surge of earth followed his command, peeling concrete jetting into the air to cover his back. Don't panic. Those are normal gunpowder-based weapons. Joseph roared. Keep running. Using the cover Damien gave them, Joseph and the others crossed the final remaining distance to the city, anxiousness clear in their demeanors. Damn it. Open the gate. Joseph roared through gritted teeth, but the doors of the city remained firmly closed. By now, the crowd beneath the city gates was growing, and there were already more than 100 that had made it this far, while several thousand more were crossing the final distance. But those of Hargrove City didn't seem to hear what was going on below. Joseph's heart was gripped with despair. Could this really be a ploy by the Empire? No, that didn't make any sense. Just what was going on? Joseph no longer seemed to have the calm-headedness he once displayed. His decision-making became cloudy, and he banged on the gates just like all the others, unable to think for himself. He was practically brought to the point of tears, as though he could see his life flashing before his very eyes. Hargrove watched this scene from above silently. It seems they understand their situation now, he said coldly. Lower the platforms. Finally, the warriors of Hargrove City began to move. But they didn't open the gates as many would have expected them to. Rather, they began to lower platforms from the top of the walls. As a veteran of governance, Hargrove understood the truth of human nature, and it would be the truth no matter which world one was born in. If things came too easy, they wouldn't be appreciated. Very easily, a great boon could become bland, a life-saving grace could be expected, and a savior could become just a person doing as they should. When annexing such a large group of people, Hargrove needed them to understand who held the power and who didn't. As for the few who died in proving this point, who cared? Seeing the platforms descending, the group of prisoners that had been wailing below suddenly began to cheer. They didn't even consider the fact their lives would still be in danger or that many more could have been saved had Hargrove chosen a different method. It was exactly as Hargrove expected. This was human nature. Down. Escobar commanded coldly. Shields at the ready. Charge. Governor Duke Owen didn't stay back. His aging body seemed even more agile than the youngsters, pouncing forward with vigor. He realized that platforms presented an opportunity. It was impossible for the thousands of prisoners that had escaped to successfully climb upon those platforms before they crossed the remaining distance. From a cursory calculation, there was only enough space for 100 people at a time, and it took half a minute for a round trip to be completed. Of course, Governor Duke Owen wasn't foolish enough to use these platforms to try and climb the city wall. That would be asking for death. However, the existence of the platforms would make breaching the gates much easier. City Lord Hargrove might have wanted to teach the prisoners a preemptive lesson with his actions, but he seemed to have not considered the fact that it would be impossible to use the archers to stop their siege if the very platforms they were using protected the warriors of Earth from above. Seeing such actions though, Hargrove sneered. Dark Cloud Prison was a place with maybe the tightest security on Earth with the exception of the Royal Palace. It could be said that in order to become a guard here, you had to be an elite amongst elites. Even those who weren't hand-picked for this job from the very beginning had been high-ranking military officials before their placement. This was all to say that the group of men and women that followed Governor Duke Owen now were all powerful combatants. However, they were all powerful combatants without the slightest idea on how to siege a city. Both men looked toward one another as though they were looking at a fool. But only a real clash would tell just who was right and who was wrong. Unfortunately, whether or not that clash would happen would soon become an unknown. Bang! 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 Just when Governor Duke Owen had already crossed the halfway mark to Hargrove City, space solidified. Another swath of charging warriors froze, unable to move a single inch. This wasn't out of fear, no. They were physically unable to control their bodies. As though they had suddenly been placed into a hardened mold of concrete, everything from their limbs even to their facial muscles didn't seem capable of budging even the slightest. The central platform the guards and Warden Owen had just come from splintered into two. Slowly, a group of prisoners, each with bright red #D tags on their chests, made their way up. The air around them seemed heavy beyond compared to the point where even the archers on Hargrove City's walls couldn't budge an inch. At the head of these dark prisoners, a lanky man with messy dirty blonde hair stood. His back was hunched and his arms were still crossed in his straitjacket. From the front, it was simply impossible to see his facial expressions because his gaze faced the ground, allowing his hair to block whatever view one might have had otherwise. His bare feet scraped along the ground, his legs barely raising as he walked forward. Yet, even as this group began to move, no one else seemed capable of doing so. A cold sweat began to bead down City Lord Hargrove's forehead. Even he struggled to move, even twitching his fingers felt as though he was lifting several tons of weight. This ability, whatever it was the most powerful he had ever seen. No. Even if he included those monsters he had heard of during his over a century worth of life. None could compare to this. Chapter 524. There seemed to be only 7 of them. No. 8? 9? The number kept changing. It should have been simple to conclude that one of them had a cloning ability, but through this thickening wall of space, let alone moving, even senses didn't seem to work properly anymore. It felt as though one was trying to cast a net several kilometers away despite the fact the group was at most several hundred meters away. As if this wasn't fear-inducing enough, while a normal distance felt like forever to everyone else. To the group, it was barely a short stroll. Though they seemed to be walking normally, they covered large distances as though they were sprinting with all their might. Not even a few seconds later, the group reached the vanguard of the dark cloud prison guards. It was only then Lionel's steps suddenly paused. In perfect unison, the group came to a pause with him. It was hard to tell what Lionel had promised these dark prisoners in not even half an hour since their attempted escape began to make them treat him like this. But the reality was displayed before them all regardless. I recognize you. Lionel's voice was quite striking in such a suddenly quiet environment. Unlike what one expected, it wasn't deep and gruff nor did it have some evil air to it. Rather, it sounded like the normal voice of a teenage boy on the cusp of adulthood. Yet, one couldn't help but feel an instinctive fear toward it. It seemed to seep into their ears and host the beating of their hearts. As though a master plucking at their strings, he was a controller of their fate. AI, that's right. You were there the day they took me away from my mother. Lionel slowly walked toward Governor Duke Owen, his head still lowered to the ground. He painted quite an odd picture. Everything from his bare feet to his straitjacket seemed completely out of place. Escobar's gaze narrowed, his body still finding it difficult to move even the slightest bit. Despite the fact the boy's face was lowered and the prisoner tag that should have been across his chest was covered by a straitjacket didn't stop the warden from recognizing Lionel immediately. He didn't say a word. Or rather, he couldn't say a word even if he wanted to. Even moving his lips was difficult. Despite the fact Earth was new to this new world order, Escobar was still aware that such an indomitable ability shouldn't possibly exist. All abilities should have limitations, weaknesses. Something like locking down the space within several hundred meters should have been absolutely impossible unless one was a higher dimensional being. However, what the Governor Duke didn't know was the fact there were indeed existences capable of such feats. And they were known as savants. Savants were existences capable of breaking the limiters of their abilities. Whether it be the issue of stamina, duration, or realm of influence, they didn't need to worry about any of this. This wasn't simply because they were able to rely on themselves, but rather because universal force naturally fueled their every action. Whereas those like Lionel or the Warden would have to comprehend universal cycles in order to use universal force. Savants had no need for such a thing. They could make use of the universe's strength as they pleased. The result of this were abilities that seemed more like the act of gods rather than mere mortals. And, in fact, on some worlds, these people were indeed known as gods. However, the price to pay for being a savant wasn't non-existent either. Much like how mortal savants of Earth were only good at one particular task, the same could be true of the savants of the dimensional verse. Outside of their abilities, the talents savants had were severely limited. Cultivating force, comprehending styles or universal cycles, even awakening lineage factors they might have been born with was all impossible. But, with such power, did they need such supplementary strengths? Lionel's hair shook somewhat. It seemed like he was shaking his head or lamenting something, or maybe he was thinking through something. He didn't have any care to give, just silently standing there as though the world would wait upon his every whim. Where is my mother? Finally, Lionel settled down on these words. But the cold sweat of Escobar's back only grew despite the stoicism of his face. In the moments Lionel remained silent, he could feel the struggle of the youth before him. Lionel's every instinct screamed to kill him, yet, as though he was internally speaking to himself in attempts to calm down, he remained silent. In the end, Lionel decided that he wanted to know about his mother more than he wanted to kill this warden before him. Vice, it seems the man can't speak, release him. Lionel said slowly. Within the group, a man who looked about 27 or 28 years old picked at his nose. Snot ran down his face, but he didn't seem to mind in the slightest. This man was none other than Vice, the wielder of the ability so many here feared so much. Vice flicked a booger toward Escobar. Only then did the warden almost collapse, finally able to move under the normal laws of physics. "Speak," Lionel said plainly, his voice still as even as it always was. "Where is my mother? What did you do to her?" Escobar coughed, feeling as though he could finally breathe normally. He pulled himself up to stand straight and tall. When he stood to his full height, he was still quite a bit shorter than Lionel despite the fact the latter had his head lowered and his back hunched. But Escobar's momentum didn't seem to dampen in the slightest due to this. Escobar's palm flipped over, causing a spear to appear. In that moment, his momentum completely changed as wild energies began to flow around him. Harsh winter winds. Fragrant spring air. Blazing summer heat. Cool fall breezes. Beneath this presence, the pressure the other guards felt alleviated by more than 80%. Though their movements were still somewhat hindered, it most definitely wasn't as exaggerated as it had been before. In the distance, Hargrove's pupils constricted into pinholes. "Impossible. Hold." Escobar's voice boomed when the other guards wanted to take action. He looked toward Lionel seriously, the latter having seemingly not reacted to the sudden change. "Your mother is dead. What do you plan to do with this information?" Chapter 525. Lionel didn't say a thing for a long while. He continued to look at the ground, his arms strapped around his body beneath his straitjacket. For a moment, it seemed as though he hadn't heard a single word that was spoken. However, a bloodthirsty aura was slowly forming around him. Lionel's head tilted upward. Through the strands of his hair, one could finally just barely make out one of his eyes. It was a vacant pale green that seemed to stare at nothing and everything at the same time. The faint illusion of blood-red wings spread to Lionel's back, the distorted image of a demon hanging around him. In just a few moments, those red wings formed into the image of a female angel. Her red wings wrapped around Lionel, her arms holding onto him tightly. It was just an illusion, but it seemed oh so real. Tears of blood began to uncontrollably fall from the eyes of those around Lionel. With the exception of Escobar, they all seemed to be affected by the change. "I see. Since she's dead, what reason do you have to keep living?" Under the astonished gazes of many, thousands of dark cloud prison guards suddenly turned their weapons onto themselves. Bang! The sounds of several gunshots rang at once. But, from afar, it sounded like just a single gun had been fired. The actions were so smooth and in sync that even the pulling of so many triggers seemed to come from a single point. Escobar's gaze widened before gaining a tinge of red. In that moment, just as Lionel's words descended, he suddenly felt an overwhelming will to spear his skull through. If he hadn't bit his tongue, he really might have gone through with it. His heart trembled. Just what kind of maddening ability was this? The bloody angel hanging around Lionel only seemed to grow more corporeal as though being fed by the deaths of those around her. Her visage became clearer, a doting expression on her face as she lightly stroked Lionel's hair. No matter how one looked at her, it seemed like she was a proud mother. Or rather, she would have been had it not been for the fact her eye sockets were filled with nothing but an endless void. The sound of collapsing bodies filled the quiet air. In an instant, over half of a 10,000-man army fell into a pool of their own blood, their weapons painted with their own life. The scene was absolutely horrid and a metallic stench soon filled the air. Escobar's grip on his spear tightened. He could still see Lionel's singular eye through the strands of his hair, looking at him curiously as though he was wondering why it was he hadn't died when he told him to. As for the other, it seemed to stay hidden behind a veil of darkness, lurking. The Governor Duke could no longer hold back. He felt like this child had been wronged, so he gave him a chance and spoke the truth. However, he had never expected for his moment of soft-heartedness to cost him half of his men in a single breath. There was a limit to his understanding, to his sympathy. This was no longer the baby in those photos, this was a monster. A monster he had to kill. Die. Escobar's spear seemed to encompass the world. Its point became the origin and its shaft became purpose. In the blink of an eye, the spear tip appeared before Lionel's brow. With just a half a foot more, the skull of this young man would be pierced through. However, would things really be so easy? A mirror suddenly manifested before Lionel. Escobar's spear tip hardly touched its surface before it was reflected back. The warden was sent flying, his spear-wielding arm splintering in two. The horrid imagery of a forearm being split in half down its length etched itself into the hearts of all those who saw it. Within Lionel's group, a young woman with disheveled hair bit at her fingernails to the point they bled. But, even then, she didn't seem intent on stopping. She looked toward Escobar warily as though she was the one who should fear him rather than the other way around. It was as though she was completely oblivious to how powerful she was. Lionel stood in place indifferently. It was as though he couldn't tell that his life had been on the line. Or, maybe, it hadn't ever truly been. Escobar's face became a deathly pale. He looked toward his arm incredulously, unable to believe what had just happened. He hadn't awakened a powerful ability. In fact, it was of the mere C-grade upon awakening. However, he had never cared much because his spear arts could more than make up for this. With the time he had spent with Lionel's father, it was doubtful that there was anyone on earth who could match his comprehension of the spear. So, how had he suffered so greatly just now? It was at that moment that there was a sudden change to the battlefield. Lionel and Aina led a charge out of the forest edge that surrounded Dark Cloud Prison. It had taken them several hours, but they had finally cleared out all the scouts and carved a path here. And, luckily, they had managed to avoid any casualties in huge thanks to Lionel's leadership abilities. However, what they saw after they reached the clearing of flat lands astounded them. A city fallen from the skies, a group of prisoners frozen in their attempt to climb its walls, and, over 5,000 dead guards, lying in a pool of their own blood. The sight was horrid, but what left Lionel the most stunned was the appearance of a particular man. Despite the distance of over 200 kilometers that separated them, with Lionel's senses, Escobar might as well have been inches from his face. Coach. Lionel's expression flickered with confusion. What was Coach Owen doing here? No matter how long passed, Lionel would never mistake that rat of a mustache for anyone else. Seeing the state of Coach Owen's arm, Lionel's anger suddenly flared. If there were two people he had to pick as the duo he respected the most in his life, the first would be his father, and the second would be this man right before him. In that moment, the battlefield suddenly gained a second bloodthirsty aura, one that seemed to rival Lionel's without the slightest hint of losing out. However, it was then that something completely unexpected happened. Lionel looked toward the new arrivals with curiosity. But, when his gaze landed on Lionel, he was shocked. You look exactly like me. Lionel's head finally raised all the way, both of his eyes and his face finally becoming clear. However, when Lionel saw this face, his brows furrowed. This wasn't because Lionel looked like him, but because of the exact opposite. They, quite honestly, looked nothing alike. What the hell was this person talking about? Chapter 526. Lionel's face was exceptionally pale. One couldn't call him either handsome or ugly, but simply average. Though, it was a bit difficult to tell if this was the best he could do, or if it was simply because he was malnourished. With how sunken his cheeks were, it was clear that he had never had enough to eat. So, though he looked quite plain now, he may very well look different if he finally began to receive enough sustenance. However, this wasn't the reason Lionel felt he looked nothing like him. The truth was that with Lionel's senses, it was quite easy for him to fill in Lionel's features and extrapolate how the latter would look. But, even then, they were nothing alike. Lionel's jaw wasn't as sharp as his own, his cheeks weren't as high, and his nose was far more prominent and pointed. In addition, Lionel was only just about 2 meters tall now, or 66. He had grown a few inches since his last day at Royal Blue Academy. But Lionel could tell that if Lionel stood straight, the latter would be over 7 feet tall, a full head taller than Lionel. Whether Lionel and Lionel looked the same was hardly relevant on any other day. But, when the first words out of Lionel's mouth was that they were identical, it left Lionel at a loss. Just what was that supposed to mean? The truth of the matter was that other than the color of their eyes and the fact Lionel had the same messy, dirty blonde hair Lionel once had before he activated his metal synergy lineage factor, they were quite literally nothing alike. And, as though to drive this point further, Lionel kept getting an uneasy feeling from the vacancy in Lionel's gaze. Lionel sounded so cheerful and his words even seemed to carry the hint of being pleasantly surprised, all while his gaze remained as deadpan as could be. This reality only made Lionel feel more uneasy. "Stay alert," Lionel said softly. His words were only heard by those to his back. Lionel continued to observe Lionel curiously, a faint excitement that never reached his eyes dancing across his expression. "Are we related? Are you my brother perhaps? A cousin who happens to look a lot like me? Are we? Sorry, I forget the word. I think it starts with AT. Tweens maybe? Twines? Forget it. My mother, do you know her?" Lionel's frown deepened. His social awareness is severely lacking. His expressions all seem to be slightly off. The only way he'd think we look the same is if he had never seen himself in a mirror before. But, even then, why would that be the conclusion he jumped to? Even if he had never seen himself in a mirror before, where would he get the thought that I was who he looked like? Where would he have seen me before? The more Lionel thought, the more he came to understand that Dark Cloud Prison wasn't as simple as he originally thought. The only obvious conclusion he could make was that these men and women before him were actually prisoners. That much was obvious. After all, they all wore the same garbs, so this wasn't a hard conclusion to come to. What was more damning was the fact that these prisoners acted as though they had never seen the light of day. Lionel shook his head. It seemed he was too naive. There was no way that the Empire prison would be as perfect as they tried to make it seem to be. "He's dangerous," Ana's voice drifted to Lionel's ears. Lionel nodded seriously, his fists clenching. In the distance, when Governor Duke Owen realized that it was Lionel who had appeared, his gaze flashed with a complicated light. He almost forgot about the horrible pain shaking his body. However, Lionel no longer had the mind to pay to his coach Owen. It wasn't because he didn't care about his life. In fact, there was no other person here who he cared more about with the exception of Ana. But, he had to take action now. There was something odd about the atmosphere. It should have been a battle between Hargrove City and Dark Cloud Prison. But, somehow, this group, led by Lionel, had interfered and become the main enemy. Lionel also felt like if he moved forward any further, a strong spatial lock would collapse around him. At the moment, it had been weakened considerably due to what seemed like Escobar's domain of universal force. But, considering the state of his coach at the moment, how much longer could he really hold out? Lionel blinked, feeling somewhat disappointed. "Why won't you answer me?" In response, Lionel flipped over a palm, a pitch-black spear appearing in his hand. The little mink seemed to awaken atop his head, the little guy's gaze locked onto the group before them. "Maybe I didn't give you enough information?" Lionel wondered aloud to himself. "My name is Lionel Morales. As for my mother's name, I'm not sure. Do we share a family name?" Lionel froze. What the hell? Ana's brows furrowed in confusion as well. Was there really such a coincidence in the world? Believing that someone shared the same name as Lionel wasn't too surprising. Before the metamorphosis, Earth's population was counted in the tens of billions, approaching 100 billion. Back then, there were no shortage of people who shared not only the same first name, but even the same last name, and there were even more people who shared the same name pronunciation but differed in the spelling. However, what made this instance particularly shocking was the fact that Lionel's first words had been that he and Lionel looked identical. Could there be such a coincidence in this world? Confusion colored Lionel's features. He had just steeled himself to attack, but now he questioned himself. Was this a practical joke? But why did it not seem like one? What was going on here exactly? Chapter 527. Could it be a mind-reading ability? Aina communicated secretly with Lionel. Lionel gazed toward the fading blood angel to Lionel's back. After a moment, he steeled himself. Nika. Yes, Captain. A young girl called out to Lionel's back. Reconstruct the scene. Send the images to me. Don't hold back. Yes. Nika worked quickly. She was one of the few sensory types among Lionel's troop, but her ability was unique. She was able to reconstruct the cause and effect of a location, essentially simulating the past events of a place for up to 1 month. She could also transmit these images and deductions to another person. At her ability's current stage of evolution, it had limited usage in battle. But, when it came to reconnaissance, she was second to none. When Lionel felt Nika's dream force penetrate toward him, he didn't resist. Usually, Nika wouldn't dare to do this with anyone else. Those with dream force affinity were incredibly rare, and it would be too easy for one to get lost in the events she displayed. However, Lionel was different. When Lionel opened his eyes once again, he had a grasp of the entire situation, even down to the abilities Lionel's group had displayed. Leave this, Lionel, to me. Lionel said plainly, his gaze suddenly becoming cold and indifferent. Stay within my domain and do not leave, or else I can't guarantee your safety. After seeing the past events, Lionel understood Lionel's ability. Such a person was too dangerous. He would defeat him first, then ask questions later. Clang. 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 A black domain filled with illusory chains surged into existence around Lionel, covering a radius of just over 20 meters in every direction. Lionel immediately realized that this was his limit. He couldn't extend his domain any further without sapping his stamina faster than he could get returns on. But, this size was just enough. Brandishing his spear, Lionel pointed it toward Lionel, his aura stifling. Those around Lionel immediately realized that Lionel was giving off a different feeling compared to the others. On the Hargrove city walls, many were still frozen in place due to Vice's ability. Whether it was the raising and lowering of the platforms, the archers, or even Salnas himself, no one seemed capable of moving. But, truthfully, though they feared Vice somewhat, they were more than willing to see the talents of Earth at each other's throats in this way. Anared's gaze narrowed as he locked onto Lionel in the distance. But, the latter hadn't even spared the city a glance after the first look. It was as though he couldn't be bothered to care about it. Inwardly, Anared was a bit shocked. He knew how many scouts they had deployed. How had a 250-man squad managed to come this far without a single one sending word back? The truth was that Anared had already gotten reports from the north of the continent, and there was currently a major battle going on over there. However, he didn't care to go and oversee those matters personally because taking in these prisoners was far more important to Terrain's overall plan. As long as Noah was stalled, that would be far more than enough. Initially, when Anared didn't hear back from the south, he had thought that meant Earth only sent one squad. After all, according to their intelligence, Noah was the only acting commander of this troop of Earth's talents. What he didn't expect, though, was for Lionel to have carved a path out of the south for himself. Dealing with a savant won't be so easy, yet you've chosen to antagonize such a large group of them on your own. You've signed your own death certificate. Anared thought coldly. At this moment, even he could hardly move. Though he had his trump cards to do so just like Coach Owen had, he didn't care to activate them just yet. Right now, he was content to lay back and watch. However, Anared's expression when he observed the dome around Lionel couldn't help but turn serious. He didn't know what it was, but for some reason it left him feeling uneasy. He couldn't help but wonder if this was Lionel's ability. When Lionel saw Lionel point a spear toward him, his voice trailed off, the excitement at once had fading. He couldn't seem to wrap his mind around why someone who had such a high chance of being his brother would treat him like this. Lionel, don't. Coach Owen mustered all the strength he had left to shout out this warning. Just run. This isn't your fight. Lionel paused, sending a glance toward his coach. Hey coach. Lionel suddenly grinned. Let's make a deal, all right? No. Coach Owen said firmly. Hey. You haven't even heard what I wanted to say just yet. Are you that protective of that dead rat you call a mustache? Kid. The surviving guards of Dark Cloud Prison were stunned, especially Escobar's right-hand man, Garwin. None of them had ever seen anyone treat their Governor Duke like this. Lionel laughed. Just sit tight, old man. As long as I survive, though, you have to promise to shave that sad excuse for facial hair off. Lionel's air of confidence hung over the battlefield, completely overshadowing Lionel's bloodthirsty aura. The stark difference between the two men was apparent at a single glance. Just looking at Lionel's back and feeling the security of his domain made the youths following feel a second wind hit their sails. They had just fought a bloody battle over the course of several hours, how could they not feel tired? But now, they felt as though they could battle for several hours more. PCHU. The sudden sound caught everyone off guard. In such an atmosphere, it was the last sound one expected to hear. It was the kind of change that left everyone dazed. Coach Owen looked down, only to find a bloody hole in his gut. Blood overflowed so densely that it almost looked like a waterfall of black, fusing into his dark military garb without a sense of how precious it was. With a splutter, blood leaked out from Coach Owen's lips, running over his chin and down his neck. He felt his life quickly draining from him. Lionel looked toward Coach Owen, a slight light illuminating his eye for the first time. But, this light held no humanity. Rather, it held nothing but madness. You called him Lionel. Why did you call him Lionel? Why did you call him Lionel? Important note below January 6, 22. Chapter 528. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. Lionel had never expected for such a thing to happen. After being blown away by a mysterious mirror ability, his coach Owen had flown back more than 100 meters from Lionel. The distance that separated them couldn't be considered to be small. By any logic, it shouldn't have been possible to attack the Governor Duke without giving Lionel time to respond. But, the facts were laid out before them all. Coach Owen's own spear shot through his belly, his blood painting its shaft crimson. With a cough, Escobar slumped backward, his breathing growing incredibly shallow. Ana's eyes widened. But in the next instant, her gaze snapped toward Lionel, flashes of worry lighting her irises. Unfortunately, it was already too late for her to say anything. Whatever light Lionel's aura held vanished, being washed by an oppressive might that made those in his presence feel as though a hand was descending from the skies. Tell me. Why did you call him that? Clang. 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 Lionel took a step forward, the ground beneath his feet groaning and whining. The image of a majestic bird appeared to his back. It had beautiful feathers of gold and white, eyes filled with endless wisdom and a wingspan that seemed capable of encompassing the world. Lionel's next step seemed to blur, touching the ground both so lightly and with such speed that it left nothing but an after-image in its wake. It wasn't until Lionel was already over 100 meters away from the place of its descent that the concrete suddenly folded beneath the pressure. Ana's expression changed, her head snapping back toward everyone else. Support him. Her voice held no less compulsion than Lionel's. It became quite clear quite quickly that the reason she didn't lead wasn't because she couldn't, but rather because she chose to defer to Lionel. But at this moment, there wasn't time for that. Anared looked at this change with a curious light in his eye. In truth, the only two that had a chance at shaking his position were Lionel and Ana. Since they had so graciously shown themselves. The sword that hovered to Anared's back suddenly vibrated, resonating with a sudden will to battle. As though a road of air manifested before him, Anared casually stepped off the top of Hargrove City's walls. His body seemed to resemble a sword streaking across the skies. He sliced the wind in two, intercepting Aina and the others before they could even think of supporting Lionel. At that moment, Anared felt monstrous killing intent lock onto him. Even his heart skipped a single beat before his sword force reaffirmed his resolve in the next moment. He couldn't help but frown. Nothing had shaken his heart so severely in decades. Just what was that? Leave him to me. The voice came from Anared's front, but it was clearly not aimed toward him. It took him just a moment to realize that it had actually been Aina's words for Lionel. Anared couldn't help but internally sneer. Did this girl think that he was Julnia? He could defeat someone on that level without even unsheathing his sword. Yet, Aina would have likely lost her life had it not been for Lionel's intervention. However, Aina didn't pull out her great sword as Anared had expected. In fact, she tossed it to the ground as though it was worthless, reaching to the large curved package on her back. With a thought, a massive golden-red axe appeared in her hand. Her aura completely changed, reaching a level of oppression that made Anared's indifferent expression frown. For Season's realm. If that was all, maybe Anared could accept it. But, the axe in Aina's hand was also on the cusp of entering the fifth dimension. Let alone the fact Anared had hardly seen a quasi-bronze treasure in his life, even among those he had, this was the most powerful. A violent red aura surged around Aina, a slight hint of blood wrinkling the noses of those in its presence. Veins popped up across the delicate hand she used to clench her battle ax's handle. The axe trembled with excitement, a thirst for reaping life humming its shining edges. Aina was pissed. Anared actually chose this moment to step forward when all she wanted to do was support Lionel. Even as her fighting spirit reached its peak, her eyes gave the sign of several warnings. She swore that if anything happened to Lionel, Anared and the whole of Terrain would follow him to the grave. Lionel's own emotions reached a peak as well. To this point, he hadn't hated anyone of Terrain. He felt as though they were simply doing what was best for their futures. This was the way of the world. Though he, of course, wanted to protect his world from invaders, he had never reached a point of doing it out of hatred. However, now things were different. Not only had their actions put the life of his coach on the line, but now they were even targeting Aina. If Terrain wanted his fury so badly, they could have it. Lionel appeared between his coach and Lionel, his aura towering. The shocked guards of Dark Cloud Prison suddenly felt as though an immovable pillar stood before them all. Even if the sky collapsed, it would be there to catch it. Lionel's expression became livid. Not only had this warden not answered his question, now someone else had come to block his way. No. Coach Owen mumbled weakly, trying one last time to force Lionel to run. Just die. Lionel roared. The bloody angel to Lionel's back contrasted the golden owl to Lionel's. It felt as though a clash of ages had suddenly erupted. Lionel's hair blew back, but his cold, calculating gaze remained indifferent. He observed Lionel's hysteria without a hint of emotion, his eyes seemingly even more vacant than the latter's. The likes of you couldn't possibly hope to take control of my mind. Lionel said coldly. Bind. Lionel pointed his spear forward. With a thought, chains surged, wrapping around Lionel's body in layer after layer. The dark prisoners to Lionel's back panicked. It was clear they didn't have much fighting experience, but how could they? This was the first time they had been in the outside world since they were toddlers. It was a miracle they even knew how to walk, let alone fight. This alone was a testament to just how fearsome savants were. It had been less than a few hours since this group even realized they had abilities at all, yet they were already so powerful. What would happen if they had time acclimate and grow? Would Lionel even be worthy of standing in their presence? It was difficult to tell. However, they were completely lost without Lionel's guidance. Just when Lionel planned to squeeze Lionel to death in a fit of rage, he heard muffled, irrational rambling. It's nothing but a dream, this nothing but fantasy, go away. Lionel didn't have time to sneer even if he wanted to. Before his very eyes, his chain domain, arguably his most powerful ability, began to crumble piece by piece. It wisped away like smoke in the wind, dissipating as though it really was nothing but an illusion, a fantasy, a dream. Kill him. Kill him. Kill him. Lionel roared into the skies, red tainting his vision. The space around the madman began to collapse. No, it was worse than collapsing. It was as though every bit and piece of matter was slowly being erased. A pit appeared below and above him as thought the whole world was losing its color. Vacant darkness expanded rapidly, leaving Lionel's figure and his screams as the only tangible existences that remained. Lionel's jaw clenched, finally realizing the kind of monster he was dealing with. Lionel's ability was built upon dream force, but his use of it was beyond anything Lionel could imagine. Lionel's ability was strictly internal. Even after he replaced his soul force with dream force, he was unable to turn it against his enemies and force them into an illusion the like dream abode had been able to. But, in return for this, his computational abilities were far beyond what even a machine could match, let alone what a human could do. However, Lionel was the exact opposite. Though he could somewhat use his dream force to boost his computational ability, it was nowhere near the level Lionel could. But, in return, he was able to manifest his consciousness into the world, playing with the fabric of reality as he pleased. If he wanted you to die, you would die. If he wanted you to stab yourself with your own spear, you would do so. If he wanted to erase you from existence, he could. Lionel was a monster, masquerading in the body of a frail youth who wanted to see his mother again. This realization woke Lionel from a dream he felt like he had been in from the very beginning. This world was nothing like the one he had come to know. In this world, a fairy tale like the stories of Arthur Pendragon could become real. In this world, a madman with strength could destroy everything. Chapter 529. Lionel closed his eyes. For a moment, everything else in the world seemed to vanish. His breathing grew steady and his heart stilled, even his mind, used to running at impossible speeds, slowed. After a moment, even his thoughts became vacant. In such a moment, what one should have been feeling was fear. Seeing such a monster before you, a man who was gifted with talent that others couldn't even hope to grasp, what choice was there other than to despair? However, this wasn't the reality Lionel saw before him. Rather, he saw a path that had suddenly lit a fire, blazing a trail that he hadn't noticed before. It was as though he had always been following the wrong path, completely oblivious to the right one that had always been in arm's reach. In the outside world, everyone else could only see Lionel's domain rapidly deteriorating. Lionel himself stood, completely unmoving. To his back, what remained of a once 10,000-strong army shook beneath Lionel's presence. The only thing that separated them and such a monster was a seemingly frail teenage boy who was at the end of his rope. Lionel's domain was directly tied to his ethereal glabella and his mind. Every piece of it that faded took another piece of him. Even though Lionel didn't seem capable of taking direct action against Lionel with how strong the latter's dream force affinity was, this alone was enough to severely weaken Lionel. As chain after chain disintegrated, Lionel's mind faltered and weakened. He should have been under an excruciating amount of pain, the kind of horrible, spine-tearing torture that could obliterate one's resolve. Yet, Lionel stood, completely unmoving. In the distance, Aina grew more panicked. She didn't have a detailed understanding of what was happening, but all she needed to see was the fact that the world around Lionel was crumbling. Though she had managed to hold Anared back long enough for the remaining 200-plus young warriors to curl around them, before they could even manage to get into range to do anything, one of the savants blocked their path, scratching at his rat's nest-like hair. The good news was the Lionel's rampage had interfered with Vice's ability as well, allowing them to move even without the protection of Lionel's domain. But the bad news was that this unkempt man who the others called Monkey suddenly multiplied in number. In one moment, there was just one of him. In the next instant, there was 2, then 4, then 8. In the blink of an eye, over 1,000 of him blocked the path forward, causing the troop of youths to come to a grinding halt, serious expressions on their faces. It suddenly became obvious why it was no one could tell the exact number of people Lionel had brought with him. Stay in your squads. Don't underestimate him. Niall took command of the situation, his gaze flashing with a hint of worry. Things were quickly getting out of hand. These savants had completely lost their minds. In fact, this monkey individual hadn't even blocked their path at Lionel's order. Niall could see the look in his eye quite clearly, it was boredom. He blocked them simply because he was bored of standing around. Such an enemy, without logical goals or comprehensible aspirations, they were the most fear-inducing. Niall grit his teeth, sending a look toward Lionel. It seemed as though a struggle was unfurling. On one side, there was the enraged Lionel trying to erase everything that was Lionel. And, on the other side, there was the silent Lionel trying to protect his life. It was simply impossible to see it any other way. Niall gripped onto his spear. He didn't know what he could do to help even if he made it through, but he knew he wanted to make it no matter what. He flexed the pole arm between his hands, letting the light of the setting sun reflect across the blade. He shot forward into the crowd of clones, his will steeled. Unfortunately, there were many things a strong will couldn't overcome. As quickly as he came flying forward, Niall shot back. If it wasn't for the 2 squads of 10 he led coming together to stop his flight backward, it was hard to tell just how far he would have gone. Niall's arms trembled. Though he tried to hold it back, in the next instant, he coughed violently, a mouthful of blood flying from his lips. Niall looked up, allowing his squads to help him stand. Not more than 10 meters away, the clone he had clashed with stood in a bloody mess, its head peeled open like a grotesque blooming flower of flesh and bone. What shocked Niall wasn't the fact this had happened, but rather the cause of it. In the moment, the clone had head-butted the point of his spear. However, what Niall couldn't understand was why the clones were that strong. Most of those with cloning abilities he had come across had strong limitations. Most of the time, the limitation came in number of clones or the strength of them. But somehow, Monkey didn't seem restricted by either. What Niall didn't know was that Monkey's ability wasn't a cloning ability. Monkey had the ability to double almost anything. As for the limitations of his ability, it was hard to tell. But, if Niall was aware of this, he would understand why it was he was sent flying back so easily. If Monkey could double himself 10 times and form over 1,000 clones, what would happen if he did the same with his strength? In fact, if it wasn't for the fact Monkey's flesh and blood was so frail, he would be able to exhibit far more of this strength before his body collapsed. In that case, let alone just getting flung back, Niall might have died in a single strike. If Monkey was smarter and doubled the toughness of his skin and bone, or even if he just had a weapon, his level of strength would be impossible to fathom. A grim expression took hold of Niall's visage. Even as Monkey's clone collapsed, dead, his heart didn't calm in the slightest. Looking at the over 1,000 that remained, let alone making it through to Lionel, he wondered if it would even be possible to survive. When Niall saw the somewhat curious gazes of the savants that remained, his heart plunged into despair. He couldn't understand why these people were gifted with so much strength. And, all the while, their leader was losing his mind and roaring into the skies, but they didn't even seem to notice in the slightest. When Aina saw Niall get repelled so easily, her heart constricted. Any hopes she had of Niall, Nika, and the others making it to Lionel before Lionel could harm him seemed to disappear. Out of habit, Aina began to bite at her lips again, her anxiousness growing. At the same time, she felt a belly full of rage every time her battle axe crossed paths with Anared's sword. Even though she was just a margin weaker, the ferocity of her attacks only seemed to grow. Her every strike carried the intention to kill, her heart nearly bursting out from her ribcage under the exertion. She didn't care about the stamina consumption. Every time she swung, she seemed to carry the weight of the world behind her. The clashes caused the surrounding air to explode, the temperature incrementally rising simply due to the heat coming off their blades. Still, even as she pressed so hard, she knew it was impossible to make it in time. By now, Lionel's erasure had almost reached Lionel. What remained of his chain domain seemed to be on its last legs, dispersing into minute particles before vanishing into nothingness. Ana's teeth drew blood from her lips, her anxiousness hidden beneath her mask. "Come on, set faster, set faster." Ana anxiously looked toward the sun. But its descent seemed to be ever so slow. By the time night came around, it would be too late. Anared continued to indifferently parry Ana's strikes. It wasn't that he didn't want to defeat her right here and now, but even he found it difficult to do so. There was no need for him to go all out. At this pace, she would simply tire herself out. By then, defeating her will be as easy as a single sweep of the sword. Ana sent another panicked look toward Lionel, narrowly avoiding another sword strike. "No!" Ana's infuriated shout resonated through the battlefield. For a moment, a fear that was deeply hidden within all their souls seemed to surface. Even the savants paused in their actions. With their inability to control themselves, the shock and horror was clearly painted on their faces. Even as savants, they held none of the air true experts should have. Anared's sword faltered, causing his fluid style to be interrupted. Without a choice, he could only retreat to avoid being bisected, a frown taking over his usually indifferent expression. Coach Owen closed his eyes, an aching pain far greater than the stab wound through his gut taking hold. At that moment, Lionel's domain of nothingness seemed to have reached Lionel. By all rights, it should have swallowed him whole. Even Lionel's madness gave way to a slight excitement, as though he wanted nothing more than for Lionel to disappear. However, Lionel's body remained completely unscathed. His body stood in the void of nothingness, completely indifferent, a serene expression on his face. And then, his eyes finally opened. When they did, the skies overturned, the darkening clouds of dusk dispersing and the raging winds of the battlefield slowing to a crawl. Chapter 530. Lionel's aura was like a raging tiger released from its chains. It commanded absolute respect within its territory. Chain domain. Clang. 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 The instant the words left Lionel's lips, the crumbling domain around him suddenly resurrected, coming back in full force. No, to say full force would be to assume that it came back just as strong. But the reality was very much different. In the past, the chains were illusory and their rattling rang hollow. But now, it looked as though real chains had manifested into the air, their bodies exuding a black fog that suffocated their surroundings. However, just when it felt as though just these changes were shocking enough, the domain began to change again. Royal Blue Province was a tropical location that experienced summer almost all year round. It never seemed to get too blistering hot and it never snowed. It could be said that the spring and summer should have been the seasons Lionel was the most familiar with. Still, even to this point, Lionel had failed to comprehend the four seasons realm on his own. The reason was simple: he found it difficult to wrap his mind around the concept of the seasons suddenly becoming a battle technique. Even if he knew it was possible, his mind couldn't cross an artificial barrier it put up for itself. Even after experiencing the same seasons every day for all his life, Lionel couldn't cross the final step. How was he supposed to translate such gentle climate into a battle technique? It simply didn't make any sense. For that matter, how could someone with fire elemental force ever hope to grasp the cold of winter? Or how could someone with ice elemental force ever hope to grasp summer? Lionel didn't know how long he would spend stuck at this barrier. However, what he never would have expected was for Lionel to break it for him. To say that Lionel helped Lionel grasp the four seasons realm was incorrect. Rather, Lionel taught Lionel the way he should look at this world. Lionel was often bound by logic. He felt that everything should have a natural progression and that the world should have cause and effect. In fact, even now, he still believed this. Lionel felt that there was no issue with his beliefs. Rather, there was an issue in the method by which he implemented them. In order to understand cause and effect, one had to first grasp the rules of a system. Trying to understand what was going on in a sports game without first grasping the rules would only leave you lost. To this point, Lionel was still using the rules of modern Earth. In that world, such fanciful abilities couldn't be reality. Science was the ruler, and something like a fairy tale character coming to life was nothing more than a joke. These thoughts not only fueled him, but they restrained him, bogging down his mind and limiting his thoughts. Simply put, it was foolish. But now, things were different. Lionel thought that the only seasons he was familiar with were spring and summer. As for winters and falls, though he had experienced them when traveling to other provinces, his understanding of them could be considered to be minimal. But was that really true? If Lionel was as logical as he claimed to be, had realized that seasons were decided by the tilt of Earth and its location around the sun. A season wasn't restricted by temperature, it was simply a cycle of time. Lionel was so bogged down by his own preconceptions that he didn't even manage to remember such a simple concept. The reality was that Lionel had experienced winter once a year, every year, for his whole life. Just because it didn't get bone-chillingly cold, didn't mean he hadn't. What did this mean? It meant that the seasons were about more than just surface-level conceptions. Temperature was irrelevant, climate was irrelevant, even the beautiful gradient of colors the seasons shifted between were irrelevant. In that case, what were the seasons? Everyone experienced them differently. In fact, even if one shared the same planet, if you were located in different hemispheres, the cycles wouldn't even be the same. So what was a season? What was the four seasons realm? Wasn't it just a journey around the sun? To the current Lionel, it wasn't even this. To him, the four seasons simply represented a cycle, an infinite loop dependent on countless factors. If he tweaked these factors as he pleased, he could make what he wanted out of the four seasons realm. On a large scale, the cycle encompassed an entire planet, its orbit, its tilt and its people. On a small scale, all it took was one's own domain. The moment Lionel grasped this, his aura completely changed. The amount of universal force around him skyrocketed, reaching levels that dwarfed even the savants. When Lionel unleashed the shackles on his mind, what he had done wasn't as simple as understanding the four seasons realm for a particular weapon or a particular force strengthening deviation. Rather, he embodied the four seasons realm. Everything within his domain was under his control. If Uncle Montez had been here, he would have laughed uproariously. It would have been the kind of laughter that shook the skies and forced the earth to quake. This was the true four seasons realm. Only by grasping it could domains display their true strength. The four seasons realm. The domain realm. The realm of kings. Bind. Lionel's voice came down like a command from on high. The chains of his chain domain roared like flood dragons, surging into Lionel's space of nothingness as though mythical creatures snaking through the skies. At that moment, Lionel's expression finally changed. Fear replaced the light of madness in his gaze as he retreated. The earth folded to Lionel's will, the laws of reality bending and twisting. In one instant he was in front of the savants, and in the next he was standing behind them, his expression trembling. Kill him. Lionel's voice shivered, a trembling cadence clear within. The instant he felt like he no longer held the upper hand, his air of confidence crumbled. He held none of the resolve a man should have. Hearing Lionel's command, even Monkey was forced to turn back, giving the youth warriors some reprieve. Stay back. Lionel commanded. Leave them all to me. Go and support Aina. I don't want to see Anared strutting around here any longer. Lionel's pupils flickered with a violet-red light, his aura growing heavier with each passing moment. The youths hesitated. By now, they were beaten and bloodied, many of them were even on their last legs. But, it was precisely because of this that they couldn't fathom the idea of Lionel going against them all alone. However, when Lionel looked back toward them, the look in his eye made them shiver. It felt as though a higher being was gazing upon them. The bronze runes that flickered into and out of existence, all of Lionel's body radiated a palpable pressure. Even the space around him seemed to twist and bend. Nile and the others gulped. They felt like even if they wanted to, it would have been impossible to disobey Lionel's orders. Yes, Captain. Before the youths realized what they were doing, they had already saluted and turned back, charging toward the battle between Aina and Anared. Anared frowned. He didn't know what a domain was to begin with. So, he understood even less about the changes Lionel had undergone. Regardless, facing even one savant is suicide, let alone 4. Anared retrieved his sword, retreating with light steps. Since you want to despair, I'll let you despair. Now that Vice had completely focused his abilities in Lionel's direction, those around Hargrove City had finally been released. It seemed that these fools had forgotten this was a war. However, just as he was sneering, Anared felt a cold shiver down his spine. He instinctively looked in a certain direction only to see Lionel's cold gaze locked onto him. A deep fear suddenly took root in his heart. Before, Lionel's complete indifference had left him feeling uncomfortable. But this sudden attention made him feel as though a reaper had grasped onto his throat. The look had a clear meaning. Even if you ran to the ends of the earth, you would still die. Aina's shout had engraved itself onto Lionel's heart. If Anared thought he could get away with it, he was sorely mistaken. Lionel turned his attention back to the savants before him. Monkey's thousands of clones, Candle's mysterious mirrors, Vice's spatial locks. Lionel's reality warping. Even just a single one of these savants would be enough to bring a world to its knees. Yet, with its talent, Earth had birthed 4 in just a single generation, and Lionel was crazy enough to face them all alone. The several hundred clones Monkey had remaining swarmed Lionel and suddenly doubled once again. The sight was truly one to behold. A single man facing an army of monsters. Lionel indifferently swept a gaze through them, his spear tip just barely grazing the cracked, concrete grounds. Piss off. In that moment, countless chains wrapped around Monkey's clones. Under the astonished gazes of those watching, hundreds of clones shattered into a rain of flesh, blood and bones, painting Lionel's chain domain in a dripping crimson. Chapter 531. Aina felt as though a massive weight had suddenly been taken off her shoulders. Seeing Lionel standing straight and tall, a rain of blood falling around him, a smile couldn't help but bloom beneath her mask. If others could have seen it, it would have been the kind of smile that warmed the heart regardless of her scars. Other women, when witnessing such carnage, would feel their intestines twist and their stomachs overturn. But, to Aina, it couldn't have been a more beautiful sight at that moment. Lionel shot forward, the chains of his spears dancing as though the singing chimes of a bell. Their elation shot through the battlefield, their bodies intertwining and blotting out the skies above. Lionel's speed seemed to touch a new level. His body was completely wrapped in universal force, making his actions breathe with an air of confidence that couldn't be denied. Seeing his clones destroyed, Monkey quickly moved to form new ones, but by this point, Lionel had already appeared before his main body, the indifference in his gaze making the latter shiver. Concepts of life and death weren't things the savants quite understood. Their understanding of the world was too shallow, and unlike other children, they never learned about these matters. Keeping them naive was the best way to nerf their abilities. However, even with this being the case, a fear of death was an instinct ingrained in our very beings. The cold look in Lionel's eye. The sparkling tip of his black spear. The looming aura that seemed to want to suffocate him down to his final breath. Monkey felt as though the thing he should fear most had appeared before him. At that moment, Candle finally reacted, forming a large mirror that blocked Lionel's path forward. At the same time, veins popped up across Vice's forehead, his entire being focusing on Lionel. The space around Lionel constricted and warped. A single step that would have once shot him forward 10 meters shrunk down to 5, then 2, then 1. This is my domain. Not yours. Lionel spoke indifferently. Lionel's body suddenly blurred, leaving several afterimages in his wake. He shot through a gap in Candle's mirrors, the bronze runes dancing across his body finally coming into full effect. A heavy domain of gravity manifested around Lionel, trying to force the weak-bodied savants to their knees. Vice, Lionel and Monkey reacted quickly, each countering via their own methods. Vice weakened the space around him, Monkey strengthened the muscles in his legs, and Lionel's dream force surged, weakening the gravity around him. However, Candle had no counter. She fell to the ground, nervously biting at her nails with even more fervor. Seeing the fear in her eyes, Lionel's cold indifference didn't waver. Bind. Candle suddenly found herself wrapped in chains from head to toe, a gaseous blackness wafting around her body. Candle's scream shook the hearts of all those who heard it. Not because it was fear-inducing, but rather because she sounded no different from any other scared teenage girl. The horror she felt was palpable. A strong repulsion slammed against Lionel's chains, causing the cocoon Candle had been wrapped in to bulge and buckle. Lionel shot by as though he didn't notice the oddity. But the slight paling of his expression told a different story entirely. After grasping the Four Seasons realm, Lionel felt as though the burden he once experienced when using his domain had vanished. Whereas in the past a few minutes was an issue, at this current point, even holding on for an hour shouldn't have been a problem. However, that would only hold true if all things remained equal. With such powerful opponents clashing against him, the stamina consumption he experienced was several levels higher than usual. In fact, if not for comprehending the Four Seasons realm, his domain would have already collapsed. Having come to this point, though, Lionel had no intention of reeling back now. On this battlefield, other than him, there was no other person capable of dealing with these four. He had to deal with them, and he had to deal with them all quickly before he no longer had the stamina left. The remaining three panicked as Lionel's domain enveloped them. Hearing Candle's screams and watching her get trapped without hope of escaping made them feel as though they could very well be next. In the distance, Anared's frown was deepening. By now, the archers of Hargrove City were supporting him to his back, so the pressure he felt from the 250 or so youths before him shouldn't have been much. But, as though they were rabid beasts without thought for their own safety, they continued to hound him, putting him in a difficult spot. Aina especially seemed to have no interest in letting him retreat. Before, she hadn't been able to use her birthday present due to Vice's interference. But now, she blinked about the battlefield, cutting off Anared's path of escape every time he seemed to gain a bit of daylight. Anared couldn't wrap his mind around just what kind of treasure could allow such frequent and fluid teleportation. However, when he saw that Lionel was actually suppressing the savants, his frown turned somewhat ugly. He couldn't wrap his mind around what was going on. Damn it. If only they had more time to grow. Anared didn't believe that savants were so weak. The only possible explanation was that they didn't have time to blossom to their full potential. And how could they? Savants were existences that could grow more powerful just by eating and sleeping. As long as the world they were born in continued to evolve, so would they. But these savants had spent their lives in a cell. How could they possibly display their true potential? Just when Anared thought the situation couldn't get any worse, his head snapped in a certain direction. At that very moment, from the opposite side of the battlefield, Noah led a troop of youths forward, their number no less than that the 250 or so that harassed him. The troop from the north had finally arrived. Chapter 532. Lionel appeared amidst Vice, Monkey and Lionel. With light steps, his movements became like the breeze. Every motion flowed into the next, every muscle twitch had its own purpose, every start had its end. He embodied the cycle of the Four Seasons to an extreme. And, when this was fused with the winged swordsman style, Lionel became untouchable. Monkey sent out a punch that shattered the sound barrier. Even before it reached Lionel, his arms burst beneath the strain, sprinkling out with drizzling blood. Seemingly noticing his mistake, Monkey rectified it mid-punch. He doubled his bonus healing factor again and solidified the skin and bone in his arm. On the fly, his attack became several levels more lethal. His eyes, hidden behind his messy, unkempt hair, seemed to light up as though he had learned something new. Initially, all he wanted to do was get rid of the pain he was feeling. After all, he didn't personally experience the deaths of his clones, so he couldn't instinctually react to what needed to be fixed. But now that he had no choice but to attack with his main body, the talent of a savant shone through like never before. While Monkey's punch threatened to take Lionel's head, Vice also reacted. He focused on Lionel once again, his spatial suppression coming down. But, just as easily, Lionel broke through it once again, using the tip of his spear to parry Monkey's fist. Lionel's spear snaked around Monkey's arm like a viper, aiming right for the latter's head. It was simply an impossibility for Monkey's combat awareness to surpass Lionel's. One had practically been on a battlefield for the entirety of the past more than year of his life, while the other was in the first fight of his lifetime. But, just when Lionel's spear would have run through Monkey's head, the latter's neck suddenly doubled in length, bending itself out of the way. His ability. Lionel narrowed his eyes. Among those here, Monkey had the most versatile ability. He seemed to be capable of doing anything with it. By now, Lionel had come to understand that it was a doubling ability and that it seemed to have almost no limits. In fact, Lionel was certain that Monkey had to have doubled his reaction speed and fast twitch muscles as well, or else dodging his counter would have been impossible. The worst part was that the more times Monkey was put in a life-threatening situation, the more ways he learned to get out of it, and the more powerful he grew. If Lionel had to assign a danger level to these savants, Monkey wouldn't even be far behind Lionel, who could even warp reality to his whim. I see. In that case, they'll just bombard you with more new information than you can adapt to. Lionel pulled back his spear, his chains lashing out against Monkey, Vice, and Lionel all at once. By now, Lionel was a shell of his former self. Lionel was too perfect of a counter to him. All he could seem to do was use his ability to escape. But any attempts he made to attack fell flat. Still, his escaping ability alone was giving Lionel a headache. The longer this fight dragged on, the more powerful Monkey became, and there was no guarantee that Vice wouldn't become cleverer in using his ability as well. On top of that, Candle was still constantly fighting back against his chains, draining his stamina. If it wasn't for the fact he was so focused on keeping Candle trapped, he would have long since made far more use of his domain against Monkey and Vice. If it was up to him, he would have already constricted Candle to death, but he realized that doing so would be no better than suicide for him. Candle's ability was dependent on the strength of her opponent. The more Lionel constricted, the more strength she had to push back, and the greater drain his stamina would experience. To make matters worse, Lionel didn't have to initiate the strength either. At the moment, Candle was pressing her mirrors against her cocoon of chains in order to escape. But, in doing so, Lionel's chains applied pressure in order to stop her. This pressure was then reflected back, causing an endless cycle to ensue. Essentially, the more strength Lionel placed into keeping Candle trapped, the more strength he had to use to resist her entrapment. This left Lionel with no choice but to slowly allow the cocoon Candle was wrapped in to slowly expand. Only by doing this could Lionel slow Candle's escape, but this also put a timer on his battle. There was only so large he could allow Candle's cocoon to become before it exceeded the range of his domain. By then, how could he possibly keep her trapped? Candle seemed to realize this subconsciously, so she formed more and more mirrors, lining them against Lionel's chains and pushing with all her might. However, Lionel was much more intelligent than Candle was. The moment the cocoon around Candle reached 5 meters in diameter, Lionel manifested new chains around Candle, allowing the outer structure to collapse. Candle's mirrors shot in every direction, no longer having anything to press against. But, without her sight, Candle had no ability to gauge just where her mirrors were going as she suddenly found herself trapped once again. Lionel indifferently gazed down toward Monkey, who was brandishing yet another fist at him. He seemed to be completely detached from the events happening around him, as though he was a master puppeteer observing things from on high. Just when Monkey's fist was about to connect, Lionel's body flickered, a halo of golden light enveloping him as his speed reached impossible levels. Monkey's fist lost its target, suddenly finding itself flying toward a mirror. At that same moment, the chains Lionel had sent lashing out at Monkey and Vice aimed for their mirrors as well. The timing was impeccable and the result was devastating. Monkey's fist crashed into the mirror at the same instant Lionel's numerous chains did. Candle's ability was very simple. It had the ability to reflect and multiply the strikes it received. Not only would one have to face the strength of their own attack, but it would also be multiplied in strength by several times. That was already horrible enough, something Coach Owen could attest to. But, what if on top of your own attack, you had to deal with the amplification of several others at the same time? Bang! An entire half of Monkey's body exploded. As though a bomb had gone off within his body, his chest, arm, leg and even half his head erupted into a rain of blood and gore. Chapter 533. A harsh silence overtook the battlefield. Even though Lionel had managed to hold his ground until now, for anyone with battle experience, it was clear that whatever advantage he had had was slowly fading. As the savants became more and more accustomed to battle, their strengths continued to evolve and the upper hand Lionel had had was slowing to a crawl. However, just when others thought that Lionel was about to be forced into a corner, a single move flipped the situation of the battlefield on its head. Everyone was always guessing at what Lionel's ability might be. Some thought his light elemental affinity was the core of his ability, others thought it was his bronze runes, some even believed that it was his spear affinity. Lionel knew well, though, that none of these things were where his true strengths lay. As he stated before, what Lionel grasped from Lionel wasn't the Four Seasons realm. Lionel's understanding the Four Seasons realm could only be considered a byproduct of him finally comprehending the path he should step on. The core of Lionel's prowess was now and would forever be his mind. Lionel appeared before Monkey once again, a cold indifference coloring his expression. Even now, slumped to the ground, Lionel could see that the doubling Monkey had assigned to his healing factor was still in effect. In fact, Lionel could see Monkey's body reforming before his eyes. But, would Lionel really foolishly allow such a thing to happen right in front of him? Lionel stabbed his spear down, skewering Monkey's head. The savant convulsed. Having reached a point that would be impossible for any normal human to return from, one would think that Monkey would be finished. But, Lionel actually felt Monkey's brain trying its best to heal around the shaft of his spear. The reality of it all was baffling. Lionel shook his head. With a flip of his palm, a snow globe appeared and enveloped Monkey's body. Since there was no easy way to kill Monkey for now, Lionel had no issue relying on suspended animation. When Lionel stored Monkey away and looked up, he found that Vice's state might have been better than Monkey's, but considering the fact the former didn't have any healing abilities, their situations might as well have been functionally the same. Vice had flown back like a broken kite, his limbs twisted at awkward angles and his breathing was left shallow. He lost consciousness the moment the pain reached a threshold that was beyond him. Lionel raised his spear to kill Vice, but he hesitated. By now, if he didn't understand the backstory of these prisoners, he wouldn't be worthy of his computational mind ability. However, even if he felt sympathy, he couldn't possibly allow them to do as they pleased. Lionel wasn't certain why the Ascension Empire would choose to keep these savants alive. If they were willing to kill so many of their fellow man to avoid dealing with billions of invalids, why would they suddenly be soft-hearted now? Lionel sighed. His spear descended, piercing Vice through the heart before enveloping him in another snow globe. The savants were simply too dangerous. Though Vice was in a sorry state, if he regained consciousness, his ability would be devastating. Unlike Monkey, he didn't need to move for his ability to take effect. So, Lionel decided to place him on the brink of death. That way, even if by some miracle he managed to escape the snow globe, he would only be mere seconds away from death. Lionel looked toward where Candle was trapped. Even now, she was still struggling and likely had no idea that it was her ability that turned the tides of the battlefield against her favor. Raising a hand, Lionel sent a scorching fire toward her cocoon. Though Lionel had a feeling that Candle could deflect energies as well, what would she do if her deflected energy simply made her situation worse? If she really reflected the heat back while trapped in such a place, she would only be hastening her death. At that moment, Candle's screams shook the hearts of all those who could hear it again. "Stop resisting or I'll burn you alive." Lionel's voice didn't carry a hint of emotion. It traveled to Candle's ears like a reaper's death cry. Any battle veteran would have found another method, any method other than listening to Lionel's words. But, as a naive teenage girl who knew nothing of battle, Candle shook with fear, accepting Lionel's words as gospel the moment she heard them. Just a little heat was enough to scare her out of her wits. The thought of it getting even worse shook her to her soul. Just like that, 3 savants were captured and stored into snow globes, leaving just 1 remaining. Lionel finally turned his gaze toward Lionel. Lionel shivered meeting Lionel's gaze, hints of madness, rage and fear within his eyes. He backed away, the land to his back warping as he tried to escape once again. By now, the battlefield had completely flipped in favor of Earth. With the addition of Noah's troops, the warriors of Hargrove City were driven onto their back foot. If it wasn't for the fact they had erected a city, they would have likely been forced to flee a long while ago. There was simply nothing for Lionel to rely on. Lionel crossed the distance that separated them. Now that he only had Lionel to worry about, he could focus on disrupting the flow of dream force without powerful enemies looming to his back. The truth was that Lionel's dream force affinity was just as high as Lionel's. What separated them was the use of universal force as a supplemental help. Unfortunately, Lionel didn't currently have a domain that was tailored to his ability, so he couldn't fuse his dream force with universal force like Lionel could. But, he didn't need so much to be a disruptor. Lionel found that his hold over his surroundings diminished greatly. The panic in his eyes only grew with each passing moment. Unlike with the others, Lionel had no intention of showing any sort of mercy to Lionel. Though Lionel's backstory was likely no less tragic, he lacked the naivete the others had. He couldn't be allowed to live. Lionel appeared before Lionel. Before the latter could even react, he found a spear shooting through his head. Lionel's voice was lost in a gurgle of blood. "Just wanted to see my mother." The bloody angel to Lionel's back shed a tear as its existence crumbled. Lionel didn't show any mercy in those final moments. His fire elemental force exploding along his spear, incinerating Lionel to ash. Chapter 534. Lionel stood with a clenched jaw. He had no idea if Lionel was truly related to him or not, but his last words resonated with his soul. At that moment, Lionel couldn't help but hesitate. The deed had already been done, but had he truly made the right choice? Had this been the right way to do things? Had he been true to himself and done what he wanted, or had he just used the same logic the Empire had only to add his own unique twist? "Coach." Lionel didn't sigh a breath of relief when things were over. Instead, he shot backward to Coach Owen. With Vice's ability having been blocked by Lionel for a long while now, medics had long since gotten to the Governor Duke. But, whether they'd be able to do anything was a different matter entirely. By now, those guards who weren't of help had been led by Garwin to assault Hargrove City. Among those that remained, they were all the top-of-the-line healers Dark Cloud Prison had to offer. "Get away from me, I need to speak to Lionel." Coach Owen pushed the medics away, his tactics just as gruff as usual. But, with how pale his face had become, it was clear he was on his last legs. Even his mustache seemed to have lost most of its earlier volume. Lionel made his way over, a deep frown on his features. "Shut up, old man, stop talking." Lionel's frown deepened. He kneeled down, a strong golden light enveloping him as he cast Grand Heal, as best he could. "Kid, stop." Coach Owen spoke between coughs. "Didn't I tell you to stop talking already?" Lionel was exasperated. Was this old man trying to get himself killed? What was he thinking? Coach Owen chuckled. "Just look at yourself, kid. You're at the end of your rope, but you're talking about me." Lionel looked up to find the medics giving him worried looks as though it was him with a bloody hole through his stomach and not his coach. But, before he could wonder why, a wave of fatigue grabbed hold of him and refused to let go. What Lionel hadn't realized was that his face had long since been drained of all color. A cold sweat covered every inch of his body and his breathing was short and quick. Yet, he just cast one of the strongest spells he could. He really was asking after death. Lionel grabbed onto his forehead and shook his head furiously. He should have realized. With his ability, everything on the battlefield should have been within his grasp, but because he was so worried about Coach Owen, he hadn't even realized when his perspective on the battlefield had become so shallow. In fact, he hadn't even realized when Noah made it here to support Aina and the others. He simply didn't have the stamina to spare for anything other than his own battle. Lionel looked over his shoulder to find Aina fighting. Her strength seemed to have soared, everything from her power to speed was on an entirely new level. Anared could only continuously retreat beneath her assault. Seeing this, he sighed a slight breath of relief. But, when he relaxed slightly, he felt his vision swim again. Focus up, brat. If I'm going to croak, I need to tell you this first. Lionel wrinkled his nose and shook his head, trying to regain his bearing. Stop, you're not going to die. Lionel said sternly. Are you going to let an old man say his final words? Or are you going to keep crying like a little bitch? I'm not. Lionel opened his mouth to speak, but a sudden salty taste touched his tongue. He wiped his face with a forearm, only to find a moisture that shouldn't have been there. But, even as he looked into the darkened skies, there were no clouds of rain to be found. You're a grown man now, brat. I even heard that little girlfriend of yours earlier, she's kicking more ass than you. Is this the face you want to show her? Lionel's face couldn't be considered any different than usual. In fact, it was even somewhat cold at this moment. Yet, there was no denying the redness of his eyes and the stream of tears flooding his cheeks. It was almost as though he was simply too tired to stop his normal reactions anymore, his body having reached the end of its rope. Sitting at the very edge of exhaustion, his body no longer had the same failsafes it once did. Seeing Lionel remain silent, Coach Owen chuckled. Finally, took you long enough. You brats these days can never just sit and listen. All of you scram. The medics looked at one another and had no choice but to distance themselves. Coach Owen laid on a concrete, looking up at the sky and the 2 moons that hung above. I hate to drop this in your lap, but I think a dying man has the right to be a bit willful. I've held this in for a long time and honestly it's eaten me up inside. Coach Owen's voice was as low as a whisper. Lionel could feel his life draining away. Hurry up, old man. Say what you need to say already so I can stuff you into a snow globe. When Lionel cleared his mind, he realized he had options. Though he wasn't guaranteed to find a method to save his coach, he hadn't lost all hope. He just needed to improve, grand heal. Thinking to this point, he inwardly berated himself for getting emotional. It really must be that his body was at the end of its rope. Lionel was already inwardly celebrating and his mood took a turn for the better. He even thought of making fun of the old man's mustache again. But, what he heard next left him frozen in time. Lionel isn't related to you, though he probably believes that he is. That said, you're more related than not. You both have the same eye color, same skin tone, same hair color, and were both born in the same month. And, when you were 3 years old, you both took your gene assessments at the same time in the same province. That day, you were both found to be a risk to society and slotted to become dark prisoners. Chapter 535. Lionel sat completely frozen, not understanding what it was that he was listening to. He was supposed to be a dark prisoner. He was the same as Lionel and the others. What the hell was going on? I know that it might be surprising to you, but this is the truth. Back then, you were still a part of the royal family. Though it seems like the Fox royal family is untouchable as the only family that doesn't have to rely on democracy, in order to keep this level of mystique, they have no choice but to be perfect. The idea of a prince suddenly becoming a dark prisoner wouldn't have been a big deal initially, but with the coming turmoil, the Fox family couldn't afford to have any chinks in their armor. In the end, as a commoner, #D1109 had his identity erased and became your replacement. Lionel frowned. There were too many things about this that didn't make any sense. If he was already so high profile, how could he be successfully replaced? In addition, what was the point in replacing him if the main issue was the blemishing of the Fox family? Wouldn't the blemish occur regardless? However, listening to his coach's ramblings, he finally pieced it all together. The gene assessment is technically confidential. This is especially so for high-profile individuals. After all, one had to remember that Ana's 5-star profession was hidden from most so that she wouldn't be harassed at school. However, the royal family was different. In order to breed a sense of superiority, the details of a royal family member's gene assessment was always publicized after the fact. But that didn't change the initial procedure. Effectively, the test process itself was secret while the results could be publicized at any time depending on what that might entail. After their gene assessments, both Lionel and Lionel were found to be dark prisoners and slated to be imprisoned. Considering the status of dark prisoners, even compared to Ana's 5-star health professional title, they were even more secretive than normal. After all, wasn't the existence of dark prisoners a major secret to the public? Taking advantage of this, Lionel's family was erased. By now, Lionel had no doubt that the Empire had taken advantage of the fall of the Paradise Islands to completely wipe them from existence. However, erasing Lionel was much more difficult. The gene assessment facilities he had gone to that day were top of the line and filled with influential families. Getting rid of his existence would have been impossible. So, that was where Lionel came into play. As children, they looked similar enough to pass for one another, and thus a new Lionel Morales was born while Lionel himself was sent off to Royal Blue Province to live in peace with his father, his results effectively cutting off whatever chance he had had of living in the spotlight as a prince. Understanding all of this now, Lionel couldn't help but feel sick to his stomach. He was a dark prisoner. He was the same as those madmen and women. Lionel's jaw clenched, his body subconsciously leaning back from the body of his coach. He felt a coldness he could hardly control welling up inside. Thinking back to Lionel's last words. "I just wanted to see my mother." Lionel felt as though a knife was being plunged in and out of his chest. Lionel didn't have a name, he didn't have a family, and his only purpose was to find the woman that Lionel's own family effectively erased from existence. Lionel should have been able to accept it. After all, Lionel was going to be a dark prisoner regardless of his existence. In all likelihood, his family would have had to be dealt with regardless. This shouldn't be a burden that Lionel had to bear. But, was it really like this? Wasn't Lionel also supposed to be a dark prisoner? Why wasn't his family erased? Why was it that he was the one who could sit here and pass judgment on a man he was technically no different from? What right did he have? Was he really worth more than another person because his background was greater? Did he deserve more chances because he was more talented? Was this really the kind of world he lived in? A dark fog hung over Lionel. Yip! Yip! The little mink tried to wake him up from the top of his head, yet Lionel couldn't seem to hear the little guy. In fact, even Coach Owen's last words practically fell on deaf ears. Lionel seemed to run into this time and time again. It was a kind of survivor's guilt that followed him since the very start of the metamorphosis. Lionel couldn't help but think back to a conversation he had with Roaring Black Lion all those months ago. It's funny to watch them, don't you think? Lionel chuckled slightly. What do you mean by that? They're separated into two groups. One group is too cowardly to go and wouldn't dare risk themselves. The other is also too cowardly even though they're pushing for us to go. They have no intention of putting themselves in the line of danger at all. They're only so adamant because they think we'll take on the brunt of the troubles for them. Which one do you think is worse? Roaring Black Lion did find this clown show to be quite funny. All of those powerful enough to actually make a difference weren't even speaking. Those like Lionel, him, Thunderous Clap and even King of Sea's group, were all in their own little corners of the cave. It was like they were allowing the weak to make the decision for them. The truth was that since they were the most powerful, they suffered the most to get them here. How could they have the energy to mind this argument? Most of them already made their own decision. Which is the worst? Lionel thoughtfully smiled for a moment. Probably the 7 of us who aren't speaking at all. Lionel felt like that right at this moment. He felt like he was one of those useless 7 once again, not speaking, not doing, just basking in his own talent and allowing the commoners to squabble about as they pleased, knowing that whatever decision they came to wouldn't matter to him in the slightest because he could just do what he wanted regardless since he had the larger fist. And it left him feeling sick. Chapter 536. Lionel. Coach Owen seemed to use the final bit of his strength to break through to Lionel. In return for his efforts, he spit up several more mouthfuls of blood. Whatever bloody bandages that had wrapped around his wound had been completely soaked through once again. Lionel's gaze, which had lost its focus, locked onto his coach again. But his gaze carried an added vacancy that hadn't been there before. Coach Owen sighed, coughing beside himself. Brat, though I told you these things out of my own selfish desire to vent, these are still important things for you to understand. This is the world you live in. You're one of the lucky ones who can benefit greatly from it. What you choose to do with this chance is up to you and no one else. Lionel didn't seem to react much to Coach Owen's words. He only nodded lightly, his mind not processing things as well as they used to. It was hard to tell whether this was because of his fatigue or if it was because of the information he had just received. Coach Owen shook his head. He knew that his words would have this effect, but he wanted to say them anyway. Though he said it was out of his own selfishness, it was deeper than this. Lionel needed to understand these things. It wasn't just so that he could comprehend his own privilege so that he could decide what to do with it. But, most importantly, if there ever came a day where his talent, his background, or his luck wasn't enough, he would be ready as well. How he chose to navigate these matters would be up to Lionel. Coach Owen would always say that Lionel was the most talented child he had ever come across. Even the savants who were supposedly blessed by the universe fell to him one after another. Though it could be said that these savants were immature, something told Coach Owen that even if they had been training since their youth, Lionel would have still found a way to win. However, this child who seemed to have the world at his fingertips had not an ounce of ambition. This was maybe the most frustrating thing for a mentor to see in one of their youths. Unfortunately, when you came across talents like this, simply telling them that they should be better, that they shouldn't waste their gifts, that they should make the most of the talent they were given, just didn't work. If these talents didn't decide to strive for greatness on their own, there was nothing anyone else could do. The saddest part about all of this was that even if this talent ran into a roadblock, due to their level of genius, they might not even need to try their best to cross it. This led to a perpetual cycle where these geniuses trudged through with a minimum level of effort, until they eventually reached a point where their raw genius simply wasn't enough to cross a new mountain that appeared before them. When geniuses without ambition reached this point, they would experience their first taste of failure in their lives. At that point, the vast majority of them would keel over, allowing the times and despair to roll over them. Their genius would be forever lost in time, a talent that could have bloomed would collapse, never to rise again. Lionel's talent was so outrageous that he would likely travel further than even most of those geniuses. But, there would come a day when he ran into that mountain, a mountain he couldn't climb with just his raw talent. When that day came, Lionel would collapse just like all the geniuses that came before him. Coach Owen didn't want to see such a thing. Lionel was better than most. He wasn't lazy, in fact he was one of the hardest workers Coach Owen had ever seen. But, he didn't have a single, one-minded goal to apply himself to. He had no purpose, no drive. He needed something for himself. Something that could fuel him regardless of outside sources. It couldn't come from his family, it couldn't come from a woman either. Unfortunately, Coach Owen couldn't find this drive for Lionel. He could only point him in a certain direction. This was the last thing he could do for the boy. Coach Owen never had his own family. His wife died decades ago and he never had any sons. To him, Lionel was as close to a grandson as he would ever get. He would do whatever he could to help him spread his wings. Feeling his life waning down to the final embers, Coach Owen swallowed his next mouthful of blood, gathering up the last of his strength. A final thing, kid. About James. Coach Owen sighed, his voice getting fainter. You two have always been like brothers. I watched you grow up. But Brat, you've always been too good at severing your emotions. Somewhere deep down, Coach Owen knew that this was likely one of the largest reasons Lionel was designated as a dark prisoner. But he could only push this thought away and pray that Lionel would never fall prey to such things. You always have such room for forgiveness for those who are practically strangers to you, but your rope is short for those who you look to as family. In some ways, this makes sense. But I still want you to open up your heart a bit. I'm not saying to forgive James. Just give him a chance. Take it as a dying old man's final wish. Lionel gazed toward Coach Owen, his irises flickering. All right, Coach, I'll give him a chance. I promise. Lionel spoke softly. Coach Owen's mustache bristled, his lips curling into a bloody smile as he closed his eyes. Lionel took a deep breath, bringing out a snow globe as he felt his coach's consciousness fading. With a thought, his coach being none the wiser, Lionel took his body in. Lionel sat in silence, alone. Even though the sounds of battle drifted to his ears from time to time, he practically blocked them out as though he couldn't hear a thing. One would think that he was in his own world rather than sitting in the middle of a battlefield. But the truth was that he really didn't have the strength to move a finger even if he wanted to. All that was left were his thoughts to distract him from his aching muscles. Chapter 537. Lionel looked off into blank space. His coach's final words about James didn't really register until just now. Could he forgive James? Well, he really didn't know. He didn't even know why it was James had done the things he had, so it was even harder to forgive something like this. As a brother, James should have spoken to him directly. The same words Lionel had said to Aina back then, he could have said to James. The moment someone he was close to stopped trusting him, even going to the point of not even trying to explain things to him first, he had no qualms about them letting them live life without him. If James couldn't trust him enough to speak, was such a person really his brother? Young heir Kiafur, this is a losing battle. We can't continue to stay here. We've accomplished our goal already. City Lord Hargrove sent a message to Anared. Controlling the savants was never a possibility. The moment they got hold of the A and dark prisoners, their task was complete. There was no need to continue fighting here. The only reason Anared had stepped out was to ensure the death of Lionel and potentially grab hold of a piece of Earth's world spirit. But, since that was no longer possible with the level of support and reinforcements Earth was getting, it was in their best interest to just cut their losses and leave. In truth, this operation was a resounding success. Lionel's appearance was never part of the plan, so it could be said that they had already accomplished everything they set out to do. Anared, who was still below the city walls, evading the pursuit of several of the youths, didn't react to these words immediately. He sent a glance in the distance toward Lionel's sitting figure. He seemed to be quite listless and out of place. But, if Anared wanted to make it there, he would have to cross through thousands. And, of those thousands, there were 500 who had talent beyond anything one could find on terrain. There's no need to display my full strength now. Retreat is fine too. Anared knew that Hargrove was correct. Their goal was never the savants nor Lionel. From the beginning, their goal had been the escaped prisoners and now they had thousands of them. There was no need to consider anything else for now. Anared's speed suddenly accelerated, dodging out of the way of another one of Aina's axe strikes. Timing his escape the moment Aina used another minor teleportation, he bolted backward, his display far beyond anything he had shown to this point. As for why Anared would be holding back, maybe only he knew the answer to this. No, maybe his fiancée was also aware. In the blink of an eye, Anared had made it to the base of the city. With a single leap, he made it to the top of its walls, a rain of arrows covering his ascent. Start. Anared said indifferently. Lionel's head snapped toward Hargrove City, his gaze narrowing. A strong fluctuation of force suddenly wrapped around it. It didn't take long for Lionel to understand that they wanted to relocate Hargrove City once again. That's possible? Lionel's gaze flickered. He knew more about force arts than probably anyone on Earth currently. A force art drawn with normal materials wouldn't be able to withstand the teleportation of such a large piece of land twice. He couldn't even imagine the amount of wealth that went into building the foundation of these cities to make such a thing possible. Didn't I say you wouldn't? Lionel moved to stand, having every intention of finding a way to stop the city from leaving this place. He had already said that he wouldn't be allowing Anared to leave, and he had no doubt in his mind that he would be able to follow through on that promise in that moment. But, the instant he stood, Lionel's vision suddenly swam. Before he realized what was happening to him, his body fell forward completely outside of his control. The light in his eyes dimmed, his consciousness fading. In the distance, Aina, who had turned her attention back to Lionel, worried about how he might be taking his coach's situation, suddenly cried out in shock. Abandoning thoughts of going after Anared, she shot forward like a streaking shadow. In the darkness of night, Aina's strength was on a whole other level. This wasn't because of her ability, but rather because of the abyss panther blood that she had ingested. Only this sort of environment allowed her to display the true strength of her bloodline. Truthfully, this shouldn't be the case. Unfortunately, Aina's internal sight was weak, so despite her high dark elemental affinity granted by her blood, she had trouble making use of it. Only at night could she overcome these struggles. Of course, there was also the problem of not having any techniques. She had yet to learn any dark elemental techniques, and the innate techniques of the Abyss Panther could only be used once she entered the fifth dimension. So, at this point, she could only accept her shortcomings. Luckily, this speed was enough to make it to Lionel swiftly. Unluckily, though, she wouldn't make it before he crashed into the ground. Thankfully, the little mink was by Lionel's side. With a wave of its little claws, a cloud of darkness stopped Lionel's fall and gently cradled him. By the time Aina made it to Lionel's side, he had entered such a deep sleep that he was even snoring. Aina shook her head, sending a complicated glance toward the disappearing Hargrove City. She was certain that wherever that city appeared next, there would be a whole host of problems to deal with. And she was even more certain that Lionel would be pissed with himself when he awoke to find that he had failed to stop their retreat. Aina sighed and smiled a smile that was one part bitter and another part prideful. If not for Lionel, how would so many of them have survived? But, because he worked himself so hard, he was now in such a state. Let's bring him back, little Blackstar. Yip. Yip. The little mink dove into Aina's chest. The pair walked toward the rest, Lionel hovering behind them on a cloud of darkness, his mind drifting to places unknown. You're tuning in to the Carefree Valley YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.